The waiting room smells of floor wax and old coffee and something faintly medicinal that no amount of the magazines on the side table can quite cover. The chairs are green vinyl. They squeak softly when you shift your weight, which you do because there is nothing else to do while you wait, and the waiting is the point. It is 1958. The receptionist has lacquered hair that does not move when she turns her head to answer the telephone. The telephone is beige. Everything is beige, or a shade of green that cannot decide if it is hopeful or institutional. You are here because of the scale, not the one in the bathroom that you have learned to approach in the morning with a particular quality of dread, but the doctor's scale, the one behind the curtain at the back of the examination room, which announces its verdict in pounds and ounces with the calm certainty of something that has never been wrong and does not intend to start now. You have been here before, you will be here again. This is the particular rhythm of a certain kind of woman's life in this particular decade. The other women in the waiting room are reading or pretending to. There is a copy of Good Housekeeping with a pie on the cover. There is a woman in a cream blouse who keeps smoothing her skirt over her knees as though she's trying to make it smaller by sheer persistence. There is the sound of a child somewhere in the building, not in this room, just audible through the wall, and a telephone ringing twice and stopping. The fountain pen scratches across the prescription pad at the front desk. That sound, that particular scratch. It is the sound of the decade, though no one knows it yet. The doctor will see you now. The nurse has a way of saying this that is not unkind, but is also not quite warm. The way a door held open is not the same as a welcome. You gather your handbag and stand. The green vinyl sighs as you leave it. The prescription, when it comes, will fit in the palm of your hand. The bottle will be amber, small and slightly cool to the touch when you pick it up at the pharmacy on the way home. The pills inside will rattle with a sound like rain on a tin roof, and you will take them, because the doctor said to, and because they work, and because in 1958 you had not yet learned to ask what working costs. This is a story about women and weight and the particular faith that Americans have always placed in the idea that a small pill can fix a large problem. It is also a story about doctors who believed what they were told, and pharmaceutical companies that told them things with great confidence and handsome detail men in suits, and a culture that needed women to be a certain size so badly that it was willing to medicate them to get there. It begins well before 1958. It ends, if you want to be generous, sometime in the mid-1990s. If you want to be accurate, it has not ended yet. By 1960, more than 8 million American women were taking amphetamines prescribed by their own physicians, not for energy, not to stay awake, not for any of the purposes for which amphetamines had been initially developed and deployed. They were taking them to be slender. The pills went by several names over the years. Benzedrine first, then Dexedrine, then a parade of branded variations that changed their clothes but not their chemistry. Doctors called them appetite suppressants, or diet aids, or anoretics, which is a clinical word that means, more or less, a substance that makes food uninteresting. Women called them diet pills, or sometimes just the pills. Their daughters, later, would call them by other names. You should understand the moment we are entering. The post-war years had a particular quality of expectation that pressed down on women from all directions simultaneously. The men had come home, the suburbs were being built, the appliances were arriving in a procession that felt, if you read the magazines of the period, like a kind of gift. The refrigerator, the electric mixer, the washing machine, the freezer. The implication was that a woman who lived with these things would have time now for the important work of being a wife, which the culture of the late 1940s and 1950s had decided was partly a matter of appearance. Thinness, in the years after the Second World War, became something that it had not quite been before. A visible proof of virtue. A woman who was thin was a woman who was disciplined, who did not indulge, who had, in the language of the period, self-control. A woman who was not thin was a woman who had let herself go, which is a phrase that tells you everything about how the culture understood the female body. As something that, without constant effortful management, would escape in a direction no one wanted. It was into this atmosphere, already taught with expectation, that amphetamines arrived. They had been there before in wartime. Soldiers had taken them by the handful, handed out by military medics to keep men alert through bombardment and night watches. Airmen took them before long missions. The chemical had proven itself useful in the context of war, which gave it a kind of credibility. It had been tested. It had been trusted. and when the war ended and the pills came home with the soldiers, someone inevitably noticed that one of the most consistent side effects of amphetamine use was that people who took it stopped being very interested in eating. The story that follows is not a story about monsters, though it contains some pharmaceutical companies that behaved badly enough that the distinction is worth examining. It is mostly a story about ordinary people caught inside a system that was very certain about things it did not fully understand. Doctors who prescribed in good faith, patients who swallowed in good faith, and then, decades later, the gradual uncomfortable process of understanding what that faith had cost. If you're listening to this late at night, in the particular quiet that descends when the day has finally wound itself down, you already know something about the subject of this story. You have stood on a scale, you have read a label, you have seen an advertisement and felt, however briefly, the pull of a promise. That is where we begin, in the waiting room, in 1958, with the scratch of the fountain pen and the amber bottle and everything that comes after. Somewhere in New Jersey in 1947, a woman is standing in front of a full-length mirror in a department store dressing room with a new dress half-buttoned, and an expression that has no good name in the language of that decade. The dress is beautiful. The fabric is a particular shade of green that the tag calls seafoam. The woman has been wanting this dress since she saw it in the window 3 weeks ago, and the dress does not fit the way it should, which means something in the vocabulary of 1947 that it would not mean in any other decade, and which the woman understands completely without anyone having to explain it. The Second World War had done something to the American female body that it would take decades to fully articulate. During the war, women had worked. They had riveted and welded and driven ambulances and staffed hospitals and managed households without the men who had previously managed them, and had done all of this in bodies that did not have time to be ornamental. The photographs from the war years show women who look capable, who take up space without apology. There is a quality in their posture that the culture of the following decade would spend considerable energy trying to undo. When the men came home, there was a renegotiation. It was not spoken aloud, not in any terms that would survive into the historical record as a conversation that actually happened, but it was present in every magazine cover and every advertising campaign, and every advice column of the late 1940s and early 1950s, which was the medium through which such negotiations took place. The message, delivered with cheerful persistence, was this: the wartime woman had been necessary, but the post-war woman had a different job. Her job was to be a wife, and the wife had a particular shape. Christian Dior introduced what he called the new look in 1947, and the fashion press received it as a gift. The new look had a nipped waist and a full skirt and a silhouette that required a body underneath it that was specific in its proportions. It required in particular that the waist be small. Dior himself spoke about femininity as though it was something that the war years had nearly destroyed and that his dresses were now restoring. The fashion writers agreed. The women who read the fashion writers went shopping. The dress had to fit a particular ideal, and the ideal was not one that had been arrived at by accident. What the new look also required was a foundation garment, a girdle, which is a word that the women of this period understood as a piece of infrastructure as ordinary as a brassiere and as expected. Department stores sold them in beige and white, and a pale pink called blush. They came in different grades of firmness, which the saleswomen discussed with the same matter-of-fact professionalism that a hardware store associate might apply to grades of sandpaper. A woman who was thin enough to not need one still wore one, because the silhouette required it. A woman who was not thin enough wore one and also worried. The worrying and the wearing were equally expected and equally unremarkable. The worrying was productive, in the sense that the culture needed it. An anxious woman is a purchasing woman. The beauty industry understood this early, and the pharmaceutical industry would come to understand it a little later. But first, the ground had to be prepared, and the ground was prepared by the magazines, which arrived through the mail slot each month with their cheerful covers and their quietly relentless instruction in what a woman's body was supposed to be. Look at any women's magazine from 1950 to 1965 and you will find something remarkable. The editorial content celebrates domesticity. There are recipes and decorating ideas and profiles of women who have organized their linen closets in ways that suggest a profound inner tranquility. But running alongside this content, like a quiet counter-melody, is an unrelenting stream of material about the female body and its management. Calorie counts, exercise guides, before and after photographs of women who had successfully reduced themselves, diet plans named after places, the Hollywood diet, the Mayo diet, the grapefruit diet, that implied a kind of aspirational geography, as if thinness were a destination you could travel to if only you had the right itinerary. Women read these magazines in enormous numbers. 21 million copies of women's magazines were sold each month in America in 1950. The readership was predominantly female, predominantly married, predominantly white, predominantly middle class. The demographic that the post-war economy had organized itself around, and that the advertising industry had decided was the target of everything. These women read about weight not because they were frivolous, but because the culture they lived inside had decided, in language clear enough to be understood without being spoken plainly, that their weight was a moral matter, a matter on which they would be judged, quietly and consistently, by husbands and neighbours and church acquaintances in the mirror. A heavy woman was a lazy woman, or a woman who did not love her husband enough to try, or a woman who had given up, which was the phrase the culture reserved for women who stopped performing the continuous labour of being pleasing to look at. These associations were never quite stated as rules. They were woven into the texture of ordinary life, embedded in the small exchanges of the beauty parlour and the church social and the PTA meeting, transmitted through glances and offhand remarks, and the particular quality of silence that falls when someone who has gained weight walks into a room where people know her. The weight of the silence was its own instruction. The ideal weight charts that began appearing in this period were produced by insurance companies, which is an interesting origin story for a standard of beauty. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Company published its famous tables of ideal weight by height in 1942 and revised them periodically thereafter. The tables were developed from data on mortality, which is to say, from the actuarial observation that people above a certain weight tended to die sooner. This is not entirely without scientific foundation, but the translation of mortality statistics into a set of numbers that individual women should aspire to weigh, and the cultural apparatus that formed around those numbers, was not science. It was something else. It was the authority of science deployed in the service of a social ideal. Doctors participated in this translation. General practitioners in the 1950s, by and large, believed that being overweight was unhealthy, which was at least partially true, and that it resulted from a lack of discipline, which was much more culturally constructed than medically founded. The consultation in which a doctor told a woman she needed to lose weight was a common enough encounter that it had its own routine. The doctor would note the patient's weight. The doctor would compare it to the chart on the wall. The doctor would say something that fell somewhere between advice and rebuke, expressed in the gentle certainties of a professional who does not doubt his own authority. The patient would leave with a diet sheet sometimes, and with the understanding that she had been found wanting. There was a further layer to this that the medical literature of the period did not examine, though the social sciences were beginning to notice it. The doctors who conducted these consultations were almost exclusively men, consulting about bodies that were almost exclusively women's, within a cultural framework that the doctors themselves had absorbed without questioning. They were not unusual in this. The entire structure of post-war American medicine was organized around male authority and female compliance, and the weight consultation was simply an expression of this structure made particularly intimate by the fact that it involved the patient's body being measured and found insufficient. It is worth sitting with this for a moment. The women who would eventually receive amphetamine prescriptions were not by and large seeking them out. They were not asking for a pill. They were responding to a cultural pressure so pervasive and so thoroughly internalized that it had come to feel like medical advice. When the diet sheets didn't work, which they often didn't, because human metabolism is complicated and willpower is not infinite, the next step felt like a natural progression. The next step was medication. And medication was available. The pharmaceutical companies that would develop and market amphetamines for weight loss in the 1950s were not inventing a problem in order to sell a solution. The problem had been invented already by a culture that had decided what women should weigh, and by an insurance industry that had given that decision the appearance of science. The pharmaceutical companies were entering a room that had been carefully prepared for them. They simply had to knock. The door was already unlocked. The decade between 1945 and 1955 was, if you look at it from this angle, a decade of appetite suppression that had nothing to do with pills. Women were being taught to suppress their appetite for space, for ease, for the particular freedom of a body that is not continuously under observation and judgment. The diet pill, when it arrived, was in some ways just a more efficient delivery mechanism for something the culture was already administering through other means. It made the suppression chemical, which made it faster, which made it feel like progress. This is how the best pharmaceutical stories begin. Not with a drug in search of a patient, but with a patient in search of a relief that the drug can for a little while plausibly provide. The suburb was part of the machinery. The post-war suburb was a remarkable cultural invention, a place organised around the domestic sphere, designed so that the domestic sphere would function smoothly and would make the women inside it visible to each other in ways that the city had not quite managed. In a suburb, you could see your neighbour's figure in the driveway at 8 in the morning. You could observe, at the church social or the Tupperware party or the PTA meeting, the bodies of the women you knew, and they could observe yours. And the observation had a quality of evaluation that was constant and rarely spoken and absolutely understood. The suburban body was a public body is what this means. The woman who lived in a suburb in 1955 was a woman whose physical appearance was an ongoing display, performed for an audience that included her husband, her neighbours, the women at the grocery store, the other mothers at the school gate. The diet pill arrived in this environment like a solution to a problem that had been articulated, in the vocabulary available, as a personal failing. The pill offered to address the failing efficiently. The culture that had constructed the failing called this help, and most of the women who received it believed, because they had every reason to believe, that that was what it was. The woman in the dressing room in New Jersey in 1947 does not yet know about amphetamines. She has not yet heard of Dexedrine, or of the detail men who will soon be visiting her doctor's office with samples and pamphlets and the confident smiles of men who have a solution to a problem they are certain she has. She's standing in front of a mirror in a seafoam dress that does not button properly at the waist, and she's making a private calculation that will be made by millions of women in the decade to follow. She's deciding how much of herself she's willing to lose in order to fit inside the life she's been told to want. The dress hangs from a hook by the time she leaves. The question stays with her all the way home. Amphetamine was first synthesized in 1887 by a Romanian chemist named Lazar Adeleanu, who was trying to produce something useful and succeeded in producing something that would shape the following century in ways that he could not have imagined. The compound sat quietly in the literature for decades, an interesting molecule in search of an application, until 1929, when an American pharmacologist named Gordon Alice synthesized it independently and began investigating its effects. He administered it to himself first, which was a common enough research practice at the time, and which says something about the relationship between scientists and caution in the early 20th century. The result of this self-experiment was an enthusiastic set of notes about increased alertness, elevated mood, and a general sense of capability that lasted several hours. What Alice found was that the substance made him feel considerably better, alert, energetic, confident, the kind of mental and physical amplification that, in a human being, reads as capability, and that, if you are a pharmacologist in 1929, reads as a promising treatment for a range of conditions. Alice worked with SmithKline and French, a pharmaceutical company that recognized the potential and moved quickly. By 1932, amphetamine was available in the United States as an over-the-counter inhaler for nasal congestion, sold under the trade name Benzedrine. The inhaler was small and aluminum and smelled of menthol and something else, something sharper underneath. The Benzedrine inhaler was a small device, about the size of a lipstick, containing a strip of paper saturated with amphetamine. The user would open it and inhale. The intended effect was decongestion. The actual effect, for many users, was a great deal more interesting, and the inhaler acquired a secondary use among college students and jazz musicians and truck drivers and anyone else who needed to stay awake and had heard from someone that this small tube was the solution. The company was not unaware of this. The company was also not alarmed by it, at least not yet. They were selling inhalers as fast as they could produce them. The tablets came next. Benzedrine sulfate 10 milligrams, available by prescription for narcolepsy, depression, and a condition called minimal brain dysfunction in children, which is what attention difficulties were called before the diagnostic categories that would come later. The tablets were white and slightly bitter, and they worked in the sense that people who took them felt, for a period of hours, that they could accomplish things. This is a property of amphetamine that has never been disputed. The disputes are about what comes after, which is a different kind of question. The Second World War created a demand for alertness at a scale that no previous market had imagined. The German military had been issuing methamphetamine, the more potent relative of amphetamine, to its forces since the early days of the campaign in Poland. The pills were called Pervitin and were distributed with the same casual authority as rations. The German command believed, and was not entirely wrong in believing, that soldiers on methamphetamine could march farther and fight longer and recover more quickly from the psychological shock of combat. The civilian population also had access, briefly, before the Wehrmacht decided the supply was needed at the front. The British and American military followed with their own programs. American soldiers were issued Benzedrine tablets through standard medical supply channels. The RAF calculated that amphetamine use increased the effective operational range of its bomber crews. The Japanese issued methamphetamine to their factory workers and their kamikaze pilots, the latter being a use case that does not repay extended contemplation. The pilots who flew their final missions under the influence of Heropon, the Japanese brand name, were not making a free choice in any meaningful sense. They were doing what they were given to do with the chemical assistance their government had decided was appropriate. By the end of the war, between 100 and 200 million Benzedrine tablets had been distributed to Allied troops. The number is staggering enough to deserve a moment of quiet attention. That is a very large quantity of a very potent stimulant, administered to a very large number of people, who then, when the war ended, came home. Some of them came home with habits they had not had before. Most of them came home having understood, at a cellular level, that this particular chemical made you feel capable in circumstances that might otherwise be difficult. That knowledge did not evaporate with demobilization. It accompanied the veterans through the mustering out process and into the suburbs and into the new lives they were building, and some of it found its way, indirectly, into the medicine cabinets of the households they returned to. The pharmaceutical industry saw what it had. It saw a molecule with proven efficacy in the field, established distribution channels, a large population of doctors who had experience prescribing it in military contexts, and a post-war civilian market that was both prosperous and, thanks to the cultural machinery being assembled around the female body, anxious in a way that was commercially useful. The transition from wartime alertness aid to domestic medication was not a single decision made in a boardroom. It was a gradual reframing, conducted through scientific literature and advertising, and the conversations between pharmaceutical detail men and general practitioners that would, in the decade to come, be the primary mechanism through which American medicine was shaped. The key refrain was the discovery, or rather the formalization, of appetite suppression. Doctors had noticed it in their patients. Patients had noticed it in themselves. It was not subtle. When you took amphetamine, food became less interesting. The familiar urgency of hunger muted itself into something more like a distant suggestion. Meals could be skipped without the willpower that dieting normally required, because the will was not being asked to do anything. The pill simply removed the desire. And in the America of 1950, the removal of the desire to eat was worth a great deal of money. SmithKline and French filed the first application to use amphetamine for weight loss with the Food and Drug Administration in 1947. The FDA approved it. The company moved quickly to develop marketing materials that reframe Benzedrine as an appetite suppressant, and then to develop a more refined version, Dexedrine, which was the dextroamphetamine isomer of amphetamine, meaning it was the half of the molecule that produced the desired effects most efficiently. Dexedrine was approved in 1947 and would become, through the 1950s and 1960s, the most widely prescribed weight loss medication in the United States. The name was carefully chosen. It had a medical sound, a scientific sound, a sound that suggested precision and cleanliness. The marketing language of this period is fascinating in the particular way that historical language becomes fascinating when you can see clearly what it was designed to do. The advertisements directed at physicians, and in this era, most pharmaceutical advertising was directed at physicians rather than patients, spoke of Dexedrine in terms of patient outcomes and clinical efficacy. They showed before and after photographs. They cited studies. The language was the language of science, cool and measured and authoritative. But the emotional content of these advertisements was something else entirely. It was the language of transformation, of the woman reshaped into her better self, of medicine as a form of self-improvement that carried the blessing of the medical establishment. Consider what was actually being sold. A woman comes to her doctor weighing more than the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company chart suggests she should. The doctor, trained to view excess weight as a medical problem and equipped with a pill that reliably reduces appetite, writes a prescription. The woman takes the pills, the woman loses weight, the doctor is satisfied, the pharmaceutical company sells more pills, the insurance company actuaries look at their tables, and the culture gets what it wanted, which is a thinner woman, administered efficiently and with the imprimatur of medical authority. It was a remarkably clean system, if you did not ask too many questions about the women who were inside it. By 1952, amphetamines were the most commonly prescribed medications in the United States for women who were considered overweight. By 1958, the number of prescriptions had tripled. By 1962, the pharmaceutical market for appetite-suppressing amphetamines was estimated at $250 million annually, which in the currency of that decade represents an almost incomprehensible commercial success. This is before you consider the secondary markets, the pills that move between women without prescriptions, borrowed from neighbours or sisters, or the woman at the PTA meeting who seemed to have such good energy. The formal market and the informal market together created a pharmaceutical ecology that had no precedent in American medicine and that would not be understood as what it was, a mass experiment in chronic stimulant use for nearly 2 decades. The marketing to physicians was sophisticated and, by the standards of the time, entirely legal. Detail men were the human face of pharmaceutical marketing. Sales representatives who called on doctors in their offices, left samples, and explained the clinical literature in terms that were enthusiastic without being precisely dishonest. The detail men who called on doctors with amphetamine products in the 1950s were carrying a product with genuine clinical support for short-term weight loss. The studies showed it. The doctors saw it in their patients. The problem, which the studies did not address, and which the detail men did not mention, was what happened after the short term. What happened to the appetite, to the metabolism, to the neurological system that had been operating under daily amphetamine supplementation for months and years? The detail men also carried, in their briefcases, the studies that had been conducted and the studies that had not. The studies that had not been conducted included long-term safety studies, studies of dependence and withdrawal, studies that followed patients for more than a few months. The medical literature of the period contains a remarkable absence of longitudinal data on amphetamine use for weight loss. This absence was not accidental. Pharmaceutical companies, in this era, were not required to conduct long-term studies before seeking approval. They were required to show that a drug worked for its indicated purpose over the period of the clinical trial. They showed that. The rest was a question that nobody was formally required to answer. What the pharmaceutical companies understood, though they would not have used this language, was that the question of what happens to a woman who takes amphetamines for a year, or 5 years, or 10, was a question that could remain open for a very long time before anyone with authority required an answer. Medicine moves slowly when the answers are expensive. It moves quickly when the answers are profitable. The appetite suppressant market of the 1950s was among the most profitable pharmaceutical markets in American history, and the silence around its long-term effects was, in its way, as carefully maintained as any of the advertising claims. The pill had arrived. The conversation about what the pill cost had not yet begun. That conversation would take 20 years to start and another decade to reach the people who needed to hear it. If you enjoy listening to sleep stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. The doctor's office in 1955 was a particular kind of room. It smelled of antiseptic and, underneath that, of the wool upholstery on the examination table and the slight staleness that accumulates in any room where people sit and worry for decades. There was usually a diploma on the wall, framed in dark wood, and a model of something anatomical, a spine, perhaps, or a cross-section of the eye, that sat on a shelf alongside medical textbooks with cracked spines. The doctor's desk was between you and the doctor. It was not a symbolic arrangement, but it functioned as one. Everything in the room had been arranged, consciously or not, to make clear who held the knowledge and who had come to receive it. General practitioners in this decade were almost exclusively male. The woman sitting across from the desk was, statistically, the wife of someone, the mother of someone, a person whose own identity was organised around her relationship to others. The doctor called her by her first name. She called him doctor. This was the protocol, and the protocol was a kind of architecture, establishing who was the authority in the room before a single medical fact had been discussed. This asymmetry was not remarked upon because it was the normal condition of the encounter and had been for as long as either party could remember. The consultation that led to an amphetamine prescription did not always begin with weight. It might begin with fatigue. With the particular exhaustion of a woman who was managing a household, and possibly a part-time job, and children, and the social obligations that the post-war suburbs generated in considerable quantity. A woman in this condition who went to her doctor and said she was tired was offering a symptom that had a spectrum of possible interpretations, and the one the doctor of the 1950s was most likely to reach for was dietary. Was she eating well? Was she getting enough sleep? Was she perhaps, he might say, carrying a little extra weight? The question was asked with kindness. The kindness was genuine. The framework it expressed was not. The measurement of weight was a standard part of the physical examination, and its interpretation was straightforward in the medicine of this period. The Metropolitan Life Insurance Company tables had been adopted so widely that they functioned as medical fact. A woman who weighed more than the table suggested for her height was a woman who was, in clinical terms, overweight. The gap between what she actually weighed and what the table said she should weigh had a name. It was her problem, and it was also the doctor's responsibility to address it. Neither party questioned the premise that the table was correct, because the table had the weight of scientific authority behind it, and because questioning it would have required your resources, time, language, confidence, that the woman sitting across the desk did not typically have. The conversation that followed was, in most cases, a kindly one. Doctors of this era had been trained in a paternalism that was not unkind, that genuinely believed it knew what was best for patients, and communicated that belief with the calm authority of expertise. The doctor would explain that losing weight would help with the fatigue or the joint pain or the blood pressure or whatever symptom had brought the woman to the office. He would explain that diet was important. He might hand her a diet sheet with calorie counts printed in a column. The diet sheet was produced by the practice and distributed to many patients, and had a quality of earnest general advice that was, in the absence of specific knowledge about her specific body, all that was available. And then, if she had tried this before and it had not worked, or if the weight to be lost was more than the doctor believed diet alone would address, he would open the top drawer of his desk and produce a sample, or reach for his prescription pad. The prescription was for Dexedrine, or Benzedrine, or one of the branded amphetamine compounds that had become, by the mid-1950s, a standard tool in the general practitioner's management of what the medical literature called obesity. The doctor explained how the pills worked. Appetite suppression. The woman would feel less hungry, eat less, and therefore weigh less. He explained the dosage, typically 5 or 10 milligrams twice a day before meals. He might mention some mild side effects. Difficulty sleeping perhaps, a little heart racing at first, nothing to worry about. He did not explain that the pills were amphetamines, not because he was hiding this, but because in the context of 1955, it did not seem like the kind of information a patient needed. Amphetamine was a pharmaceutical category, not a street term. It was a medical word, not a warning. The distance between Dexedrine and the word addiction was, in the medical vocabulary of this decade, a very long distance, and most doctors believed it was a distance that their patients would never cross, because their patients were not the kind of people who became addicted to things. Their patients were respectable suburban women with proper medical conditions. This belief requires some unpacking, because it shaped everything that followed. The medical understanding of addiction in the 1950s was heavily influenced by the cultural context that produced it, which was a context that had specific ideas about who became addicted and why. Addiction was understood as a moral failing, or as a disease of a particular kind of person, someone with weak character, or from a troubled background, or involved in activities that respectable people did not engage in. The suburban housewife sitting across from the doctor's desk was, in this framework, not the kind of person who became addicted. She was a patient receiving medical treatment for a health condition. The distinction was foundational and, as it turned out, pharmacologically irrelevant. and so the prescription was written, and the woman took it to the pharmacy, and the pharmacist filled it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone filling a prescription for blood pressure medication or thyroid supplements. The amber bottle went into her handbag. The pills went onto the kitchen counter next to the coffee maker, and the next morning before breakfast she took the first one. What happened next was, for most women, initially wonderful. The pill arrived in the bloodstream within 30 minutes of ingestion, and what it brought with it was a quality of morning energy that most of these women had not felt for years. The particular flatness of waking up and thinking about what needed to be done before coffee, before breakfast, before the children were sorted, that flatness lifted. There was a brightness to the morning, a sense of capability. The house, which had previously seemed like a quantity of tasks, now seemed like a manageable project. The appetite, which normally made its presence known by mid-morning, simply did not arrive. This was the medicine working. This was exactly what the doctor had described and exactly what the pharmaceutical company's literature had promised. Doctors noticed the results at the monthly check-in. Patients were losing weight, 5 pounds, 8 pounds, 12 pounds over the course of 2 or 3 months. The scale confirmed what the charts had predicted. The doctor noted this with satisfaction and wrote another prescription. There was a rhythm to it, clean and clinical and satisfying in the way that medicine is satisfying when it appears to be working. The patient felt better. The doctor could measure the improvement. The pharmaceutical company's product was doing what it said it would do. Everyone in the consultation room had evidence, visible and quantifiable, that things were going well. What the monthly check-in did not capture, because it was not designed to capture it, was the quality of the month in between, whether the woman was sleeping, whether she felt in the hours after the pill wore off a particular crashingness that she had not felt before she started taking them, whether in the 3rd week of the prescription she had found herself calculating how many pills remained in the bottle and dividing that number by the number of days left in the month. These were not the things a woman in 1955 necessarily knew how to say to her doctor. They were also not the things her doctor had been trained to ask about. The consultation that produced the prescription was in this way an incomplete conversation, not dishonest, not in any simple sense, but operating within a vocabulary that left out the most important words. The woman across the desk had been brought up to believe that doctors knew what was best, that medicine was trustworthy, that a prescription written on a proper pad by a credentialed physician was a solution rather than an exchange. She had not been given the tools to understand that medication could work and still be costing her something that did not show up in the monthly weigh-in. The doctor, for his part, had been trained in an era when the long-term safety of a medication was less a requirement than an assumption. If a drug worked in the short term and did not kill anyone immediately, it was considered safe. The concept of long-term monitoring, of following patients through years of medication use to understand what happened to their bodies and minds over time, was not standard practice. It would not become standard practice for some time. The gap between what the clinical trial showed and what the patient actually experienced over the years of taking the pills was a gap that the medicine of 1955 simply did not have the tools to see. The consultation ended the same way in 1 million examining rooms across the country. The doctor said something encouraging. The patient put her handbag on her shoulder. The prescription sat in her hand. She said thank you, because that is what you said when the doctor had given you something, even if you were not yet sure what you had been given. And she walked out through the waiting room, past the green vinyl chairs and the old magazines, and out into a day that felt, with the prescription in her hand, slightly more manageable than it had an hour before. Outside the doctor's office, the street had the ordinary quality of a Tuesday afternoon in whatever suburb this was. Cars moved past. A woman walked a small dog. The pharmacy was 2 blocks north. She walked there with the prescription folded in her hand and heard the little bell above the door ring as she pushed it open. And the pharmacist looked up with the neutral efficiency of someone for whom this was the 40th prescription of the day, and who handed over the amber bottle with a brief instruction about taking it before meals and not too late in the day because of the sleep issue. She nodded. She took the bag. She walked home. There is a woman in Ohio in 1961 whose name might have been Dorothy, or Margaret, or Barbara. These were the names of women in their 30s in Ohio in 1961, and she was any of them and all of them. She woke at 6:15 before her husband because she always did. She made coffee in the percolator that burped and steamed and smelled of the good thing about mornings. She put the first pill of the day on the kitchen counter next to her coffee cup, small and white and slightly chalky looking. She swallowed it before the coffee was ready, tipping it back with a glass of water in a gesture that had become, over 2 months, so automatic that she barely noticed it. The effect arrived in the carpool lane, somewhere between the second light and the bridge over the creek, while she was thinking about what to do about dinner. It arrived not as a dramatic change, but as a clarification. The world became slightly more legible. The mental list that she carried constantly, dentist appointment, casserole for Tuesday, the thing she needed to say to her mother-in-law, the hem on Margaret's school dress, resolved from a muffled cloud of obligation into something more like a list that could actually be worked through. This was the medicine working, and it felt, in 1961, like simply feeling well. Like the way she used to feel before whatever had changed, before the years of early mornings and late nights had accumulated into the particular tiredness that had brought her to the doctor's office. She did not eat breakfast. This had been the case since she started the prescription 2 months ago, and by now she had stopped noticing the absence of breakfast. Her doctor had said this was normal, expected, part of the mechanism. You simply would not feel hungry, and if you were not hungry, there was no need to eat, and if you did not eat, you would lose weight. The logic was so clean that it did not occur to her to question whether appetite was something that should be suppressed indefinitely, or what the body was doing with the hunger it was no longer allowed to express. These were not questions that the 1961 vocabulary of weight loss had prepared her to ask. The house was done by 10 o'clock in the morning, done in a way it had not been done for years or possibly ever, the particular thorough cleanliness that requires both energy and the absence of distraction. She had wiped down the baseboards, which were not in any ordinary sense dirty, and reorganized the linen cupboard in a way that made a certain kind of logical sense, and that she knew in some compartment of her mind that she had not fully opened, she would not be able to maintain when the prescription ran out. The house had the quality of a held breath. The surfaces gleamed. The floors were swept. She moved through the rooms with a sense of productive agency that was unusual and satisfying, and that she attributed straightforwardly to the medicine doing its work. Lunch was a cup of broth and sometimes a few crackers. The absence of hunger made this feel reasonable. In the early weeks of the prescription, she had worried that she wasn't eating enough, and had mentioned this to her doctor at the monthly check-in. He had said the appetite suppression was a feature, not a cause for concern, and that her body was using its stored energy, meaning its fat, and that this was exactly what they were trying to achieve. She had left the appointment reassured. The crackers stayed on the counter but were eaten infrequently. By the 3rd month, lunch had more or less ceased to exist as a meal, reduced to something she did occasionally when she remembered, and more often skipped entirely. The afternoon had a particular quality that she would not have known how to describe to her doctor. Not bad exactly, not even exactly uncomfortable, but a slight thinning of the world, a quality in the light of the afternoon that was different from the brightness of the morning. The drive to collect the children from school felt longer than it was. Conversation required a slightly more deliberate effort than it had before she started the pills. She was present and functional, but the presence was a more effortful thing than it had been. There was a kind of monitoring happening, an awareness of the effort of being there, which she did not remember being there before. What she had noticed, and had not yet said aloud to anyone, was that the period between 4 in the afternoon and the next morning's pill had a particular character that she had begun to dread in a low-level way, that she attributed to the general anxiety of the late afternoon hour. The children needed things. Her husband would be home for dinner. There were things to be done, and the energy that had made them feel manageable at 9 in the morning had left by 4. And what remained was a tiredness that was different from ordinary tiredness, more particular, more located in the absence of something specific. She would not have been able to say what the something was. She had not said this to her doctor because she was not sure it was a medical complaint. It might have been ordinary fatigue. It might have been the nature of her life, which was full. She would mention it at the next appointment, she thought, and at the next appointment the doctor noted her weight, down 11 pounds from her starting weight, and asked if she was sleeping, and she said sometimes not great, and he said they could try a small sleeping pill for that if she wanted, or she could try the Dexedrine a bit earlier in the day. She went home with the Dexedrine prescription and a sample of a barbiturate sleeping pill. the bottles lined up on the bathroom shelf beside the face cream and the aspirin. The shelf was becoming crowded. Dinner was made and eaten. She served herself a small portion because she still was not hungry, though the appetite was beginning to come back in the evenings, which she understood as the pill wearing off. She ate more at dinner than she had at the beginning of the prescription, when she had eaten almost nothing in the evenings. This was the first sign that the pill was doing what amphetamines always eventually do, which is requiring more of itself to produce the same effect. She did not know this. There was no reason she would have known this. The word tolerance was in the medical literature, but had not made its way into the conversation her doctor was having with her. After dinner, when the dishes were washed and the children were in bed, and her husband was reading and the house had arrived at its evening quietness, she sometimes sat at the kitchen table with a cup of decaffeinated coffee and noticed something that she found hard to name, not unhappiness exactly, not depression, which was a word the decade preferred not to use, more like a flatness in the air, a sense that the day had been accomplished rather than lived, that she had moved through it efficiently and was now on the other side of it, and the other side felt thinner than she had expected. She was 12 pounds lighter than she had been 6 months ago. Her doctor was pleased. Her husband had said she looked well. A woman at church had asked what she was doing, and she had said she was watching what she ate, which was technically true, and also not the whole truth. There was something about mentioning the prescription that felt like it required an explanation she wasn't sure she had. She had a medical condition. Her doctor was treating it. This was not unusual, and yet she kept the bottle in the bedroom rather than the kitchen where guests might see it. The bedroom felt more appropriate for something that was hers alone, something that she had not shared with anyone except the doctor who had prescribed it. There were 8 million women in America in 1962 whose Tuesday afternoons looked something like this. 8 million amber bottles on kitchen counters and bathroom shelves and at the back of handbags in the particular company of gum wrappers and receipts and the small personal archaeology of a woman's daily life. 8 million women who were thinner than they had been, and who were tired in a way that was difficult to account for, and who were managing, which was the word the culture offered them for the experience of functioning at a cost that was not being measured by anyone's scale. The pharmaceutical companies knew something about what Tuesday afternoon felt like. They knew it because the feedback from doctors, mediated and filtered and expressed in clinical terms, eventually conveyed the information that patients were having difficulty with the late afternoon and evening hours, and they responded, as pharmaceutical companies respond, with a product. Extended-release formulations appeared in the late 1950s, Spansul capsules, which released their payload over a period of 8 hours rather than 4, smoothed out the afternoon trough. The twice-daily dosing became once-daily dosing. The bottles on the bathroom shelves continued to be filled. The system had found a solution to its own side effect. The cycle of a day on Dexedrine was, if you stood back from it, a remarkably complete system. The morning pill produced energy and suppressed appetite. The afternoon wore off in a way that felt like withdrawal, though no one called it that. The evening was managed with a sleeping pill. The morning returned the first pill. The body inside the system adapted itself to the system, which is what bodies do, and the adaptation looked, from the outside, like ordinary life. This is the most important thing to understand about how 8 million women came to take amphetamines daily in the early 1960s. It did not feel, from the inside, like anything other than getting through the week. It felt like being well enough to manage. And managing in the particular contract of those years was what was being asked of them. What no one was asking, and what no clinical protocol of the period was designed to answer, was what the woman on the kitchen chair at 10 in the evening was doing inside all this managing. Whether the efficient, organised, 12 pounds lighter woman who moved through her days with the pharmaceutical assistance of Dexedrine was, in any meaningful sense, more herself than she had been before the prescription. Whether the calm that settled over the household each evening was the calm of a family at peace, or the calm of a system brought to equilibrium by pharmaceutical means. Whether the woman who had been asking, quietly and without a very good vocabulary, for something to change in her life had received, in the amber bottle, a change that addressed the question, or simply made the question easier to live with. These are questions that the decade did not ask, and that the medicine did not ask, and that the women themselves often did not ask until years later, when the prescriptions had ended and the weight had returned, and the distance between who they had been in 1961 and who they were afterward was large enough to see. The Tuesday afternoon endured. The pill arrived each morning. The kitchen gleamed, and somewhere underneath the gleaming, life went on in ways that the scale at the monthly check-in was not equipped to measure. The detail man carried a briefcase made of good leather with brass clasps that clicked open with a sound of quiet authority. He wore a suit that fit well without being ostentatious, and shoes that had been recently polished, and a manner that was somewhere between collegial and deferential. The manner of a man who understood that he was selling something to someone who had gone to medical school, and who needed to believe that the conversation was between equals. He called on doctors. He had a route, like a milkman, but for pharmaceuticals. He knew which doctors were easy calls and which ones needed more time, and he knew, with the particular intelligence of his profession, how to distinguish between a doctor who was sceptical and a doctor who was persuadable. SmithKline and French had the most organised detail operation in the early amphetamine market, and their approach was studied and imitated throughout the industry. The detail men were not simply salesmen. They were trained, in programs that could last months, in enough pharmacology to discuss the clinical literature intelligently with physicians, and in enough psychology to understand which arguments worked best with which kinds of doctors. They left samples, they left literature, they brought lunch sometimes, or sponsored the small educational dinners that doctors attended after hours, where a medical topic was discussed and a pharmaceutical product was introduced as the answer to the medical problem being presented. The boundary between education and marketing was, in this period, more permeable than anyone who attended these dinners liked to acknowledge. The sponsored dinner was a refinement that the pharmaceutical industry developed through the 1950s and would perfect in the decades to come. It had the appearance of education and the function of marketing, and the two were close enough in this era that the distinction was academic. A doctor who attended a dinner at which a respected colleague presented research on the management of obesity in women, and at which Dexedrine was introduced as the clinical solution supported by that research, did not experience this as advertising. He experienced it as professional development. And the next time a woman sat across his desk weighing more than the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company chart suggested she should, he reached for his prescription pad with the confidence of a professional who had been recently and thoroughly educated. The research that supported the early amphetamine prescribing was not fabricated. This is important to understand because the story of pharmaceutical marketing is sometimes told as though it involved wholesale invention of evidence, and the truth is more complicated and in some ways more disturbing. The studies that showed Dexedrine worked for weight loss in the short term were real studies that showed real results. Women who took amphetamines for 12 weeks lost more weight than women who took placebos. This was true. It was also true that virtually all of the weight was regained when the medication was stopped. And it was also true that almost none of the studies ran longer than 12 weeks. The design of the 12-week study was not accidental. A 12-week study answered the question that the pharmaceutical company needed answered, which was whether the drug produced weight loss over the period of the clinical trial. A 12-week study did not answer the question of what happened after 12 weeks, or after 12 months, or after 12 years. These were expensive questions to answer, and the regulatory environment of the 1950s did not require answers to them. The FDA approved drugs on the basis of efficacy and short-term safety. Long-term was a question for the market. The journal articles that appeared in the medical literature of this period were, in their way, masterpieces of selective emphasis. They presented the weight loss data clearly and convincingly. They noted, typically in a paragraph near the end, that the drug produced certain side effects including insomnia, nervousness, and elevated heart rate, and typically described these as mild and transient. The word dependence appeared rarely in these articles, and when it did, was usually followed by a qualifier. Dependence had not been observed in the clinical population studied, or dependence was rare in patients without a prior history of substance use. The phrase prior history did a great deal of work in these qualifications. It implied that the risk was located in the patient, not the molecule. This framing was important. It did the conceptual work of locating the risk of dependence in the patient rather than the drug. A drug that produced dependence in patients with a prior history of substance abuse was a drug that was dangerous only in the hands of a particular kind of patient, not the ordinary patient, not the suburban housewife receiving a medically supervised prescription, but the other kind of patient, the one with a troubled history, the one who was already at risk. This framing was so convenient that it survived in various forms through several decades and several generations of medications. It survived because it was useful. It allowed physicians to prescribe with confidence and pharmaceutical companies to sell without liability, and the culture to maintain the belief that dependence was a moral category rather than a pharmacological outcome. The detail men brought this literature to the doctors' offices in their briefcases alongside the samples, and they spoke about it with the confidence of people who'd been trained to speak about it confidently. The details they emphasized were the details of efficacy. The details they minimized were the details of what happened when patients stayed on the medication for years rather than weeks. And most patients did stay on the medication for years, because stopping it returned them to the appetite and the weight that the medication had been controlling, which felt like failure, which was the feeling that had sent them to the doctor in the first place. There is a name for this mechanism in pharmacology: the maintenance trap. A drug that works only while you take it, and that produces, when stopped, a return to the condition it was treating, creates patients who need to keep taking it indefinitely. This is not inherently a sign of abuse or dependence in the pharmaceutical sense. This is what happens with blood pressure medication and thyroid supplements. But those medications have metabolic targets that can be monitored and managed. An appetite suppressant's target is hunger, which is not a disease but a biological function, and a body that has been pharmacologically deprived of it for years adapts in ways that are complicated and individual and not easily measured. The pharmaceutical companies that dominated the amphetamine market through the 1950s and into the 1960s were not a monolith. SmithKline and French had the most market share, but there were dozens of branded amphetamine compounds available by prescription through this period: Dexedrine, Esketrol, Desoxin, Amphetamine, and more. The FDA had approved the core molecule, and the variations were matters of formulation and timing and dosage rather than chemistry. The competition between them kept prices low and detail men active and the flow of prescriptions steady. At the pharmacy, a woman could fill a prescription for any number of products that were, under their various trade names, essentially the same compound. It also kept the lobbying active. The pharmaceutical industry of the 1950s was not yet the political force it would become by the end of the century, but it was attentive to the regulatory environment and willing to invest in maintaining it. When rumblings began to appear in the scientific literature about the possibility that amphetamines were being overprescribed, or that the dependence potential was higher than had been acknowledged, the industry response was not to withdraw from the market. The industry response was to fund more research, to engage with the FDA in conversations about appropriate prescribing guidelines rather than restrictions, and to expand the indication, to find new medical conditions for which amphetamine might be appropriately prescribed, thereby growing the market rather than defending a shrinking one. The expansion of indications is a technique that pharmaceutical companies learned in this period and have used with great sophistication ever since. In the early 1960s, faced with growing concern about amphetamine overprescription, the industry turned its attention to depression. Women who were tired, listless, and mildly depressed, women who were, in the language of the period, suffering from housewife syndrome, were offered amphetamine-based treatments that combined the appetite suppressant with a mild antidepressant. Products like Dexamil, which paired Dexedrine with a barbiturate, were promoted for exactly this population. The detail men had new materials. The prescriptions continued, now carrying a second indication that made the prescribing feel even more clearly medical. The congressional hearings that eventually resulted in the first serious federal restrictions on amphetamine prescribing took place in the early 1970s, nearly 2 decades after Dexedrine was first approved for weight loss. Those 2 decades represent the effective lifespan of an unregulated experiment conducted on 8 million women, managed by an industry that knew what it was selling and sold it as something smaller and safer and more temporary than it was. The men with briefcases were not evil. They were doing what they had been trained to do in a regulatory environment that permitted them to do it. This does not make what happened to the women any less worth understanding. Some detail men, it should be said, were uncomfortable. Not all of them. But some, in the later years of the amphetamine era, when the dependence problem was becoming visible in the practices they served, had the experience of presenting literature that they knew was incomplete to physicians who were asking questions that the literature was not designed to answer. These men did not generally speak up. They had sales targets and territories and families of their own, and the pharmaceutical industry was not then, and is not now, an environment that rewards its sales force for raising concerns about its products. They went about their routes, they left the samples, they clicked their briefcases closed at the end of the call, and moved on to the next physician on the list. She noticed first in the mornings. Not that anything was dramatic, not that she woke one day to a revelation. It was more gradual than that, accumulating over weeks in the way that water accumulates in a basement, quietly, in the corners, invisible until it is not. She noticed that the morning without the pill had a different quality from the morning with it, a quality that she might have called sadness, if sadness were a word she had been raised to apply to herself without qualification. Instead, she called it being tired. She called it a rough patch. She mentioned it to no one, because there was no one with an adequate vocabulary for what she was describing, and because the language of personal difficulty in 1963 was a language that women of her class and situation were trained to apply very carefully. The women who noticed that something was wrong were not, by and large, the women who became the subjects of medical case studies or the faces of news magazine investigations. They were women in the ordinary middle of ordinary lives who had a private interior experience that they did not have adequate language for, in an era that had not yet developed that language and was not, frankly, eager to develop it. The language that was available to a woman in 1962 who felt wrong in a way she couldn't name was limited. Nerves, which implied weakness, depression, which implied a psychiatric problem with considerable social stigma attached, or nothing, which was the option most commonly chosen. What she was experiencing had a clinical name that her doctor might or might not have known, depending on how carefully he had read the literature. It was called Amphetamine Discontinuation Syndrome, though that name would not appear in any clinical manual for another generation. More simply, it was withdrawal, the body's protest at the removal of a substance it had come to expect, expressed in the language of physical symptoms: fatigue, irritability, the flattening of mood that the brain produces when it has been operating under amphetamine-enhanced levels of dopamine and norepinephrine and is now operating without them. The protest was not dramatic, not in the way that withdrawal from heroin or barbiturates could be dramatic. It was quieter, but it was insistent. The brain, it turns out, is flexible in ways that are not always advantageous. A brain that is regularly supplied with a substance that causes the release of dopamine will, over time, adjust its own baseline dopamine production downward. It is compensating for the surplus. This is a homeostatic mechanism, the brain's attempt to maintain equilibrium in the face of a persistent external input. The problem is that when the surplus is removed, when the pill is not taken on a given morning, the brain that has adjusted its baseline is now producing less dopamine than it was producing before the medication began. The deficit is not large in most cases, but it is sufficient to produce a morning that feels different, flatter, less capable of generating the motivation that ordinary mornings generate. She did not know any of this. There was no reason she would have. The pharmacological research that would eventually explain these mechanisms was being conducted, in this period, mostly in animal models and not finding its way into the conversations doctors were having with patients. What she knew was that she felt better with the pill and worse without it, and that when she mentioned feeling worse without it to her doctor, he noted this and wrote another prescription. The prescription was the answer that the system had available to offer. Some women went off the pills deliberately, usually because they had reached a weight they felt was acceptable, and believed the medication's work was done. What happened next was a remarkably consistent experience across a population that had no way of knowing its experiences were shared. The appetite came back, and it came back with a quality that was not simply hunger, but something closer to urgency. The energy that the pills had provided disappeared. The weight, lost over months of careful medication, returned over weeks with the efficiency of something that has always known where it lives. The doctor, presented with a patient who had regained the weight, would generally respond by renewing the prescription. This cycle, lose the weight, stop the pills, regain the weight, start again, was experienced by millions of women as personal failure. The explanation that the culture offered was consistent with the explanation the culture offered for everything to do with women and weight: lack of discipline. She had not maintained her diet. She had not exercised sufficiently. She had let herself go, which was the always available phrase, the phrase that located the problem entirely inside the woman and entirely outside the pharmaceutical product she had been prescribed. The pharmaceutical product had worked. She had failed to maintain the result. The logic was airtight in the way that a closed system is airtight. There was no exit that didn't involve accepting the premise. A smaller number of women noticed something else, something that was more difficult to attribute to personal weakness. They noticed that when they stopped the pills, they felt terrible in ways that had nothing to do with weight. They were irritable in a way that alarmed them. They could not sleep, though they were exhausted. They cried at things that did not warrant crying. They felt, in the most honest accounting, as though they had been altered and were now unable to return fully to what they had been before. This was closer to the truth than the culture permitted them to say. There were some who mentioned this to their doctors, and the responses varied considerably by doctor. Some doctors increased the prescription or added a sedative. Some doctors told them what they were experiencing was unrelated to the medication, which was not something any doctor in 1963 could have said with any evidentiary basis, because the long-term neurological effects of years of amphetamine use had not been studied. Some few doctors had read enough of the emerging literature to take the complaints seriously, to taper the medication rather than stopping it abruptly, to follow the patient through the discontinuation with some care. But this last category was small. What was happening in the aggregate across this population of 8 million women and their amber bottles and their monthly prescriptions was something that no individual doctor's office was equipped to see. Individual doctors saw individual patients. They saw a woman who had been on Dexedrine for 2 years and was losing weight and coming in monthly to renew her prescription. They did not see, because no one was asking them to see, the pattern across their entire patient population. They did not see that a significant portion of the women on long-term amphetamine prescriptions were developing a relationship to the medication that was functionally indistinguishable from dependence by any reasonable definition of that term. The letters to magazine advice columns of this period contain a thread that runs through them without ever being named directly. A woman writes that she has been on diet pills for 3 years and feels that she cannot stop them and asks if this is normal. A woman writes that her neighbour takes her diet pills in the morning and becomes difficult to be around by the afternoon, and she wonders if this could be related. A woman writes that her doctor gave her something for her weight, and she is worried because she thinks about the pills more than she thinks is right. The advice columnists, working within the available vocabulary, told them to speak to their doctors. The doctors, working within the available vocabulary, renewed the prescriptions. The loop was closed. Barbara Gordon, who would later write a memoir about her experience with benzodiazepine dependence, wrote that the particular cruelty of medication dependence in women of this era was the solitude of it. You experienced it alone because there was no public conversation about it to locate yourself within. There was no support group, no advocacy organisation, no shared vocabulary for what was happening to you. There was only the private experience of noticing that something was wrong and having no adequate way to say what. The noticing was widespread. It was happening in kitchens in Ohio and New Jersey and California, in the particular quiet of Tuesday afternoons and the edgy quality of mornings when the prescription was running low. It was happening in the gap between what the monthly check-in captured and what the month actually felt like. It was a distributed social experience with no centre, no name, and no organised response. The women who noticed something was wrong mostly noticed it alone and mostly concluded, in the absence of any other explanation, that the problem was theirs. The decade encouraged this conclusion. The woman who felt that she could not manage without her morning pill, that the day without it had a quality of difficulty that was not ordinary difficulty, lived with this knowledge privately and interpreted it as weakness. She was weak. She lacked the discipline to function without pharmaceutical assistance. This was the available interpretation, and she accepted it, as one accepts the interpretations that are offered when no better ones are available. The medication continued to be prescribed, and the amber bottles continued to arrive at the pharmacy, and the mornings continued to require the pill in a way that had not quite been what anyone had signed up for. What the noticing accumulated into over the decade of the 1960s was not a public crisis, but a private one. Thousands of individual women in thousands of individual kitchens, each believing that her difficulty was hers alone, each carrying, in the amber bottle that she could not imagine doing without, a dependence that had no name in her vocabulary, and no face in the public discourse, and no recourse in the medical system that had created it. The The problem with no name that Betty Friedan had written about was, for these women, nested inside a smaller and more specific problem with an equally stubborn absence of name. The noticing happened. The naming would take much longer. The prescribing information that accompanied Dexedrine in the 1950s and 1960s was a document that existed, like most regulatory documents of the period, in a state of careful imprecision. It listed the approved indications. It noted the contraindications. It included a section on adverse reactions that mentioned insomnia, tachycardia, and a cluster of symptoms grouped under the heading psychic disturbances, which was the era's way of saying that some patients had some difficulty when taking the medication that was hard to categorize with more specificity than that. And somewhere in the later sections, in language that had been the subject of considerable negotiation between the pharmaceutical company and the FDA, there was language about dependence. The language about dependence had been fought over. The pharmaceutical companies had not wanted the word in the prescribing information at all. The FDA, presented with clinical reports that made the complete omission of the topic untenable, had insisted on some language. The compromise was language that acknowledged the theoretical possibility of dependence, while framing it in a way that did not alarm physicians or significantly affect prescribing. The language that was eventually included said, in effect, that amphetamines had been shown to produce dependence in some patients, and that physicians should exercise caution in patients with a prior history of substance abuse. The prior history framing was important. It did the conceptual work of locating the risk of dependence in the patient rather than the drug. A drug that produced dependence in patients with a prior history of substance abuse was a drug that was dangerous only in the hands of a particular kind of patient. Not the ordinary patient, not the suburban housewife receiving a medically supervised prescription, but the other kind of patient, the one with a troubled history, the one who was already at risk. This framing was so convenient that it survived in various forms through several decades and several generations of medications. It survived because it was useful. It allowed physicians to prescribe with confidence and pharmaceutical companies to sell without liability, and the culture to maintain the belief that dependence was a moral category rather than a pharmacological outcome. The conversation between doctor and patient about dependence was, in most cases, brief to the point of non-existence. Doctors who believed in the prior history framework, and most did, because that was what they had been taught, did not consider it relevant to warn a patient who had no prior history that she might be at risk of becoming dependent on her diet pills. The warning felt unnecessary, and unnecessary warnings could undermine the therapeutic relationship, could make a patient doubt a treatment that was genuinely helping her, could introduce anxiety where there was currently compliance. The warning was therefore not given. Silence in this instance was the medical choice. What was said in the consultation room was instead a kind of optimistic silence. The doctor noted the weight loss and expressed satisfaction. The doctor renewed the prescription. If the patient mentioned feeling differently, more tired, more irritable, less like herself in ways she found hard to explain, the doctor generally interpreted this through the available diagnostic frameworks. Mild depression, perhaps. The stresses of modern life, which were considerable. The thyroid, which was a popular explanatory category in this era for a range of conditions that would later acquire more specific diagnoses. There was almost always something available to explain why a woman might not feel entirely well that was not the medication. The framing of women's distress in this decade is a subject that fills bookshelves and will continue to fill them. Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique in 1963, and one of the things she named was the particular unhappiness of women who had been told that the domestic sphere was fulfilling, and who found that it was not, or not always, or not without cost. The book became a phenomenon because it gave language to something millions of women had been experiencing alone. But Friedan's book did not address medication directly, and the relationship between the unhappiness it described and the pills that were being prescribed for the women experiencing that unhappiness was not, in 1963, a connection that had been made in any public forum. There was a connection. A woman whose days consisted of the repetitive domestic labour of the 1950s suburban household, and who was also expected to be cheerful and slender and sexually available and socially engaged, and who experienced the flatness, or the sadness, or the low-level dread that Friedan would name as the problem with no name. That woman was a woman to whom an energizing, appetite-suppressing medication was being offered by her doctor. and the medication worked, in the short term, to smooth over the experience of the flatness. It provided the energy and the interest in activity that the flatness had removed. It was, in a sense, medicating the symptoms of a social condition. The social condition remained. The medication addressed its manifestation. The conversation that never happened in the doctor's office was the conversation about what the medication was actually treating. Not obesity, which was the clinical indication, not appetite, which was the mechanism, but the particular combination of circumstances that produced a woman sitting in a doctor's office in 1958, believing that her body was the problem requiring medical intervention, when the problem might more accurately have been described as a set of cultural conditions that were being imposed on her body and that her body was struggling to accommodate. This conversation was not possible within the medicine of the period, and not only because the medicine lacked the vocabulary. It was not possible because having it would have required the medical system to question a set of assumptions about women and their bodies that the medical system was not prepared to question. The drugs prescribed alongside the amphetamines are also part of this story. By the early 1960s, it was not uncommon for a woman receiving an amphetamine prescription to also be receiving a prescription for a barbiturate to help her sleep, and perhaps a minor tranquilizer. The early benzodiazepines were entering the market in this period, for the anxiety and irritability that the amphetamine produced. The drugs were addressing each other's side effects. The amphetamine produced insomnia. The barbiturate addressed the insomnia. The amphetamine produced irritability and mood instability. The tranquilizer smoothed these. The woman at the centre of this pharmaceutical arrangement was being maintained in a pharmacological equilibrium that required all of its components continuously. If one was removed, the system became unstable. Diazepam, Valium, was introduced in 1963 and within a decade became the most prescribed drug in America. Its primary market was women. The advertising for Valium in medical journals showed a woman at the centre of a web of household tasks trapped in the demands of her domestic role, with the caption, "Whatever the diagnosis, whatever the stress, Valium can help." The diagnostic category implied was not specific. It was the general category of being a woman in the early 1960s, which was apparently sufficiently defined as a medical condition to warrant a pharmaceutical response. The Rolling Stones would write a song about it in 1966, which would become one of the most famous recordings in the history of popular music, and in which the word "mother's little helper" refers to exactly these pills. The two drug classes, amphetamines and benzodiazepines, operated on the same population and addressed between them the problem of being a woman who was expected to be thin and calm and energetic and functional in circumstances that were not always conducive to any of these states. The amphetamine provided energy and suppressed appetite. The benzodiazepine smoothed the nervous system that the amphetamine had irritated. Together, they were a system, not a conspiratorial system, not one that had been deliberately designed to serve a particular social function, but a system that had emerged from the convergence of available pharmaceutical products, clinical prescribing norms, and the expectations that the culture placed on the bodies and minds of women. The women inside this system generally did not experience it as a system. They experienced it as their personal medical situation, managed by their personal physician, involving their personal collection of prescriptions. The pills were on their kitchen counters. The bottles had their names on them. The system was invisible precisely because it was so ordinary, so distributed across so many individual lives that no one perspective on it was large enough to see its shape. It is not a comfortable thing to look at this system from the distance of several decades. It is not comfortable because it was effective, in the narrow sense that it kept women functional within a set of social expectations that the culture had constructed for them, and it was effective at a cost that the culture chose not to account for, and that the medicine of the period did not have the tools to see, and that the women inside it bore privately, in the amber silence of their kitchens, in the particular quality of the mid-afternoon, in all the small ways that people carry the cost of things for which no one has written them a receipt. The doctors of this period, the ones who wrote the prescriptions and renewed them month after month, and noted the weight loss and expressed satisfaction, were not monsters. Most of them were doing the best they could within the constraints of what they knew and what the system they worked inside required of them. They were educated in an era that did not teach them to be suspicious of pharmaceutical companies' claims. They were trained in a framework that located the problem of weight in the body and the solution in the prescription pad. They had no adequate tools for seeing what was happening to their patients over the years, because the tools for that kind of longitudinal observation had not yet been developed, and because the structure of general practice, monthly 15-minute appointments with a focus on the immediate complaint, was not designed for it. What the doctor said in 1960, in 1 million consultation rooms across the country, was what the system had trained him to say. He said, "You're doing well. The weight is coming down. Here is your prescription." He meant it kindly. He believed it. And the woman across the desk, who had been taught to trust the doctor and the prescription and the system that produced them, went home to her amber bottle and her Tuesday afternoon, and the particular silence that descends when something is wrong and there is no word for it. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. The amphetamine era did not end with a dramatic announcement. It did not end because a study was published that changed everything overnight, or because a senator gave a speech that the culture heard and understood. It ended the way these things always end, in stages, through the accumulated pressure of too many things that could no longer be ignored, administered by a regulatory apparatus that moved with the deliberate caution of an institution that is trying to close a barn door when the horses are already several fields away. The first significant signal came not from the weight loss market, but from the counterculture. By the mid-1960s, amphetamine had acquired a second life that was not medical and not quiet. The pills that were being prescribed to suburban housewives were also being taken in quantities and for purposes that their prescribing physicians had not sanctioned. College students took them for exams, truckers took them for long hauls, and a subculture of heavier users was developing around injected methamphetamine, speed, that would eventually contribute to the political momentum that produced federal regulation. The Senate held hearings. The newspapers ran stories. The word epidemic appeared. The Controlled Substances Act of 1970 was the legislative centerpiece of Richard Nixon's war on drugs, which was itself a more complicated political project than its stated rationale suggested. The CSA created a scheduling system for drugs, with Schedule 1 reserved for substances with no accepted medical use and high abuse potential, and Schedule 2 for substances with accepted medical use but high abuse potential. Amphetamines were placed in Schedule 2, alongside cocaine and morphine. This was a significant reclassification. Schedule 2 status meant that prescriptions required written orders, could not be telephoned in, could not be refilled without a new prescription, and were subject to quotas on production. The immediate practical effect of the CSA on the weight loss market was substantial. The casual prescription by telephone that had characterized the industry's relationship with the suburban housewife population became legally impossible. Physicians who had been refilling amphetamine prescriptions with minimal oversight now faced paperwork and quotas and the increased scrutiny of a scheduling classification that associated their prescription pad with narcotics. Many physicians stopped prescribing. The volume of amphetamine prescriptions for weight loss dropped significantly through the early 1970s. For the women who had been on these medications for years, the practical experience of the prescription stopping was not an event with a clear structure. There was no national program to support amphetamine discontinuation. There was no protocol distributed to physicians for tapering patients who had been on long-term high-dose amphetamine therapy. The physicians who were stopping the prescriptions were generally stopping them because the regulatory environment had made continued prescribing inconvenient or risky, not because they had developed a clinical plan for managing withdrawal in their patients. Withdrawal, in a population of 8 million women who had been taking daily amphetamines for anywhere from 2 to 15 years, was an experience that has never been comprehensively documented, because no one was looking for it. What we know is assembled from individual accounts, from letters and memoirs and oral histories, and from the clinical literature of the period, which was beginning, tentatively, to address what the prescribing literature should have addressed a decade earlier. The pieces do not add up to a complete picture. They add up to a suggestion of the scale of what was not being seen. The withdrawal from long-term amphetamine use is not physically dangerous in the way that alcohol or barbiturate withdrawal can be. There are no seizures, no delirium tremens, no risk of death from the cessation itself. What there is instead is a profound heaviness, a fatigue that is not ordinary tiredness but something closer to the removal of a load-bearing wall. Everything that was being supported by the medication is now resting directly on the person, and the person has spent years not knowing that this was what the medication was doing. The mood crashes, the appetite returns insistently, having been suppressed for years. Sleep is disrupted for weeks or months. This is what was happening in the suburbs, quietly, in the early 1970s, in a country that was simultaneously fighting a war on drugs and beginning to understand, through the growing feminist movement, that the medical treatment of women's bodies had been something other than straightforwardly benevolent. The women who were stopping their amphetamine prescriptions were doing so in a cultural context that offered them almost no framework for understanding what was happening to them. The word withdrawal was associated in the public mind with heroin. Their experience was not heroin withdrawal, but it was also not nothing, and the distance between those two poles contained a great deal of suffering that had no adequate name. Some women went back to their doctors. The doctors, now operating under the new regulatory requirements, could not simply renew the prescription. They offered alternatives. The early 1970s saw a proliferation of new, non-amphetamine appetite suppressants, developed in part because the pharmaceutical industry had correctly anticipated the regulatory tightening and had been working, through the 1960s, on molecules that achieved some of the weight loss effect of amphetamines without the scheduling implications. Fenfluramine, phentermine, diethylpropion. These were products that were already in development or on the market by the time the CSA made amphetamine prescribing significantly more difficult. The market was ready for them. Fenfluramine had been approved by the FDA in 1973 and was being marketed for weight loss. Its mechanism was different from amphetamine. It worked primarily on serotonin rather than dopamine and norepinephrine, and it produced a different quality of effect. Patients on fenfluramine lost weight, but without the energy boost of amphetamine, and many experienced drowsiness rather than the stimulated alertness that had been part of amphetamine's appeal. It was less popular, but it was available, and it was not a Schedule II substance, and in the regulatory landscape of the early 1970s, availability and ease of prescribing were significant advantages. Phentermine had been available since 1959 and was, like fenfluramine, a non-amphetamine appetite suppressant that escaped Schedule II status because it was chemically distinct enough from amphetamine to be classified differently. Phentermine worked on the sympathomimetic pathway. It was an adrenergic stimulant that produced some of the appetite-suppressing effects of amphetamine through a different mechanism. It was widely prescribed through the 1960s and would become important again in the 1990s, for reasons that will become clear. The end of the amphetamine era was also the beginning of a pattern that would repeat in weight loss pharmacology with striking regularity. The regulated drug is replaced by the less studied drug, which is prescribed widely, which eventually develops its own problems, which are not discovered until the drug has been on the market long enough for the problems to have accumulated, at which point the cycle begins again. This pattern did not begin with amphetamines, and it did not end with them. It is the structural tendency of a pharmaceutical market in which the pressure to provide solutions is greater than the capacity to fully understand the solutions being provided. The women who stopped their amphetamine prescriptions in the early 1970s and were offered fenfluramine or phentermine, or another of the available alternatives, were, in many cases, simply transferring from one medication to another, from one chapter of the story to the next. They did not know they were inside a story that had chapters. They did not know that the medication they were being offered had been on the market for a shorter time than the medication it replaced, that the long-term studies which would have captured its risks had not been completed, that the pattern they were inside was a pattern that had already played out once and would play out again. What the women of the early 1970s experienced as the prescription slowed and stopped was, from the inside, simply the ending of something that had organised their days for years. The amber bottle on the kitchen counter was replaced by a different bottle, or by nothing. The mornings had a different quality. The weight, which had been the reason for everything, returned in most cases, and the return of the weight was experienced as the failure of the woman, rather than the failure of the medication, because this was the only explanation the culture had available, and because the women themselves had, over years of absorbing this explanation, come to believe it. The era ended quietly, in the suburban kitchen, with the particular silence of a treatment that had stopped without explanation, and a weight that had come back without shame. There was no official acknowledgement that anything significant had happened. There was no apology. There was no clinical protocol for managing the aftermath of decades of amphetamine prescribing. There was just the next morning, and the next, and the body reassembling itself in the absence of what it had been given, finding its way back to an equilibrium that was not the equilibrium it remembered from before the amber bottle arrived. Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique in February 1963, and within a year it had sold more than 1 million copies. The book was about unhappiness, specifically the unhappiness of women who had been told, by every cultural authority available to them, that the domestic sphere was the appropriate expression of their nature, and who had found, on arrival at the domestic sphere, that this was not quite true, or was not the whole truth, or was true for some women and not for others, in ways that the culture's confident prescriptions had not accounted for. Friedan called it the problem with no name, which is a phrase that entered the language because it named precisely the nature of the difficulty, a thing that people experienced but could not articulate because the vocabulary for articulating it had not yet been developed. What Friedan did not write about in The Feminine Mystique was the prescription pad. She wrote about the mystique, the cultural ideology, but not about the pharmaceutical response to the unhappiness the mystique produced. This was not because the pharmaceutical response was invisible in 1963. By 1963, more than 8 million American women were taking amphetamines, and Valium was being introduced into a market that would receive it with extraordinary enthusiasm. The two facts, the unhappiness and the medication, were happening simultaneously, in the same households, in some cases in the same women. But Friedan's analysis operated at the level of ideology, and the pills operated at the level of the body, and the connection between the two was not yet available as a political analysis. The connection would be made eventually by the feminist health movement of the late 1960s and 1970s. The Boston Women's Health Book Collective published the first edition of Our Bodies Ourselves in 1970, and it was among the first popular texts to examine the medical treatment of women's bodies with the kind of critical attention that had previously been applied to other systems of power. The book argued, in language that was blunt and unfamiliar and received with considerable resistance, that the medical system's treatment of women's bodies was not simply the application of neutral scientific knowledge, but was shaped by assumptions about women, who they were, what they needed, what their bodies were for, that were cultural rather than biological. Our Bodies, Ourselves, discussed medication. It discussed the ways in which tranquilizers and sedatives and amphetamines were being prescribed to women in quantities that bore a suspicious relationship to the stresses of the social conditions women inhabited rather than to any discrete medical pathology. The book was not primarily about pharmaceutical safety. It was about women's relationship to medical authority more broadly, but its analysis of medication prescribing for women was sharp enough to make a significant number of readers look at the amber bottles on their kitchen counters with new eyes. The political analysis and the pharmaceutical reality were, through the early 1970s, converging. The congressional hearings that produced the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 had been partly precipitated by the work of journalists and advocates who had documented the scale of amphetamine overprescribing, not specifically to women, because the street drug use of amphetamine by young men and the prescribed drug use by suburban housewives were not yet being analysed together, but the documentation of the total scale of the problem was sufficient to produce legislative action. Nelson Gaylord, a senator from Wisconsin, held hearings specifically on the prescribing of amphetamines to women in 1972. The hearings documented what the prescribing data had been showing for years. The testimony at those hearings included physicians who had prescribed amphetamines for weight loss, and who were, in some cases, beginning to reconsider their prescribing practices in light of the growing evidence about dependence. It included women who had taken the medications and had experienced difficulty stopping them, and who, in the particular historical moment of the early 1970s feminist movement, had the political context to understand their experience not as personal weakness, but as the predictable result of being prescribed an addictive substance without adequate informed consent. The gap between these two groups, the physicians reconsidering and the patients reframing, was illuminating. The physicians, in most cases, described their prescribing as medically appropriate for the period, and acknowledged that the emerging evidence about dependence was concerning and committed to more careful prescribing going forward. The women described something different. They described the experience of having been told that a medication was safe and non-addictive and medically appropriate, and of having discovered, through the experience of trying to stop it, that none of these claims was fully accurate. They described the withdrawal symptoms that their doctors had attributed to other causes. They described the isolation of experiencing something for which there was no public language and no medical support. The gap between these testimonies was not about facts. Both groups were describing the same events. The gap was about who bore responsibility for those events and about what the events meant. For the physicians, they meant that medicine had acted in good faith with imperfect information, and that the appropriate response was better information and more careful prescribing. For the women, they meant something larger, that the medical system's relationship to women's bodies was structured in ways that made this kind of harm likely to occur and unlikely to be prevented, and that the appropriate response was structural rather than clinical. This larger analysis did not prevail in the policy response of the early 1970s. The response that prevailed was the clinical one: better prescribing guidelines, Schedule II classification, tighter controls. The cultural and structural dimensions of the problem, the way the prescribing had emerged from and reinforced a particular set of assumptions about women's bodies and their management, were not addressed in any regulatory document. They were addressed, with varying degrees of success, in the feminist literature of the decade. But feminist literature and regulatory frameworks operate in different spheres, and the sphere where the amber bottles were filled was the regulatory one. What the early 1970s produced, then, was a moment of partial accountability. The prescribing was curtailed. The women who had been taking the medications were largely left to manage the curtailment without clinical support. The pharmaceutical industry pivoted to new products. The cultural pressure that had produced the market for the original products remained essentially unchanged. The waiting room continued to fill. The scale continued to function. The conversation between doctor and patient continued to organize itself around the question of what the patient weighed and what could be done about it. The feminist health movement of the 1970s is perhaps the most interesting chapter of this history that did not fully enter the mainstream. It produced rigorous, politically sophisticated analysis of the relationship between pharmaceutical markets and the social construction of women's bodies as problems requiring medical management. It predicted, with reasonable accuracy, the pattern that would produce Fen-Phen in the 1990s and the problems that Fen-Phen would generate. The prediction was available in print for anyone who wanted to read it. It was not widely read, at least not in the circles that made the relevant decisions. The physicians who prescribed Fen-Phen in 1996 and 1997 were not, for the most part, familiar with the feminist health literature of the 1970s. The FDA Advisory Committee that approved Redux in 1996 was not reasoning from a framework that included the cultural analysis of weight loss pharmacology as a recurring pattern. The pharmaceutical companies that marketed Fen-Phen were responding to a market that they understood as a medical market, rather than as a culturally constructed market, whose construction had been analysed and documented. This is how a history can be available and still not function as a lesson. The lesson was there. The institutional structures that would have required engagement with it were not. And so the Fen-Phen generation of patients walked into the same waiting room that the Dexedrine generation had occupied, and sat in chairs that had been reupholstered but not substantially changed, and received prescriptions from doctors who were offering the best available treatment, and who were, in the nature of the moment, not fully equipped to see that the best available treatment was one chapter in a story whose arc they had not read. The naming that Friedan began in 1963, and that the feminist health movement extended through the 1970s, was the beginning of a vocabulary that is still being completed. The vocabulary for understanding the relationship between cultural expectations of women's bodies and the pharmaceutical markets those expectations produce is richer now than it has ever been. It is richer in the academic literature, in the popular press, in the conversation that women have with each other, online and in person, in ways that were not possible in 1958 or 1963 or 1973. Whether this richer vocabulary is making its way into the examination rooms is a different question. The examination room is a constrained space, with a specific time limit and a specific purpose, and a specific set of professional norms that govern what is said and how. The history of women's weight loss pharmacology exists outside that space. The decision about what medication to take happens inside it. The gap between outside and inside is not impossible to bridge. It is, in fact, exactly the gap that this story has been trying to cross, in the particular quiet of a night when there is time for the kind of knowledge that the examination room cannot always accommodate. The 1990s opened with a particular quality of optimism about the pharmaceutical management of weight that, if you had been paying attention to the previous 40 years, might have seemed familiar in a way that was not entirely reassuring. The obesity epidemic, a phrase that was itself new, that had entered medical discourse with a specific intensity in the late 1980s, as the statistical data accumulated and the public health implications were quantified, had created a demand for solutions that the available medications were not fully meeting. Dieting was not working, at least not durably. Behavior modification programs helped, but required sustained effort. The search was ongoing, as it always is, for something more efficient, something that could be prescribed. Michael Weintraub was a physician and researcher at the University of Rochester who published in 1992 the results of a clinical trial that would change everything for the next 5 years. Weintraub had been investigating the combination of two drugs that were individually known and individually approved for weight loss, fenfluramine and phentermine. Neither drug was new. Fenfluramine had been approved since 1973. Phentermine had been approved since 1959. What Weintraub did was combine them in a clinical trial that ran for 4 years, considerably longer than the 12-week studies that had characterized the amphetamine era, and produced results that were, by the standards of weight loss pharmacology, remarkable. Patients on the combination lost an average of 30 pounds and maintained most of that loss for the duration of the 4-year trial. This was unprecedented. The medical literature on weight loss drugs was full of short-term successes and long-term failures, and here was a study showing sustained weight loss over years. The medical community received this with considerable excitement. The pharmaceutical companies that made fenfluramine and phentermine received it with even more excitement, because neither drug was under patent and both were therefore generic. But the combination, which acquired the nickname Fen-Phen, was something that could be marketed as a treatment protocol even without a patent on the specific combination. American Home Products, the maker of the branded version of fenfluramine called Pondimin, and later of a new version called Redux, which contained only the dextro isomer of fenfluramine and was called dexfenfluramine, moved aggressively to capitalize on the interest generated by the Weintraub study. Redux was approved by the FDA in 1996, after a contentious approval process that included internal FDA scientists expressing concerns about the drug's safety profile that were overruled by the FDA's advisory committee and by the political pressure of a public health crisis around obesity that made the committee reluctant to block a treatment that appeared to work. The FDA approved Redux with a labeling requirement that noted an association with primary pulmonary hypertension, a rare but serious and potentially fatal lung condition. The warning was there, it was noted and moved past. The Fen-Phen combination was never itself FDA approved as a combination. What Weintraub had studied was an off-label use of two individually approved drugs. Off-label prescribing is legal in the United States, and by the mid-1990s, the Fen-Phen combination was being prescribed off-label on a very large scale indeed. Estimates suggest that in 1996 and 1997, somewhere between 6 and 8 million Americans were prescribed Fen-Phen. The speed with which this happened, from a 1992 study to 8 million patients in 5 years, is a measure of how hungry the culture was for a weight loss solution that appeared to be backed by rigorous long-term data. The detail men were active again, though they were called something different now, and the dinners at which they spoke were called continuing medical education programs, and the research they presented was more sophisticated than the studies that had sold Dexedrine in 1955, but the fundamental structure of the interaction was familiar. A physician in private practice who attended enough of these events came away with a detailed understanding of the clinical evidence supporting Fen-Phen and a somewhat less detailed understanding of the safety questions that remained open. The safety questions had been raised, they had not been closed. The question that was being raised and then not being answered was whether fenfluramine, specifically its effect on serotonin metabolism, was damaging to cardiac valves. Serotonin receptors are present in heart valves, and serotonin has been known since the 1960s to cause a specific kind of valve disease in patients with carcinoid tumours, which release large quantities of serotonin into the bloodstream. The pharmacological parallel was not difficult to draw. Researchers at the Mayo Clinic drew it explicitly in a letter to the New England Journal of Medicine, published in July 1997, which reported 24 patients who had developed unusual cardiac valve abnormalities after taking Fen-Phen. 24 patients is a small number, But the Mayo Clinic letter was followed quickly by reports from other institutions, and within weeks the FDA had received enough voluntary adverse event reports to begin a formal investigation. The investigation moved with unusual speed. The FDA can sometimes take years to act on safety signals, but the combination of the high-profile Mayo Clinic letter and the political environment around the obesity crisis created pressure for faster action. In September 1997, American Home Products voluntarily withdrew Pondamin and Redux from the market. The withdrawal came with a statement from the company that acknowledged the cardiac valve findings and expressed concern for patients. It came with a recommendation that patients who had been on the drugs contact their physicians and be evaluated with echocardiography, and it came with numbers which were released in the weeks following the withdrawal and which were more alarming than the original Mayo Clinic report had suggested. The FDA conducted an echocardiographic screening study of Fen-Phen users and found that approximately 30% of patients who had taken the combination for more than 3 months had evidence of abnormal cardiac valve function. The specific findings were aortic regurgitation and mitral regurgitation, meaning that the valves were not closing completely and were allowing blood to flow backward in the heart. In most cases, the abnormalities were mild and the clinical significance was unclear. In some cases, they were more severe. A small number of patients had developed serious valvular heart disease that required surgical intervention. The range of outcomes was wide, and the factors that determined which patient had which outcome were not, at the time of the withdrawal, fully understood. 30% is a number worth sitting with. Among a population of 6 to 8 million patients, 30% with echocardiographic abnormalities represents millions of people who had taken a medication that their doctors had prescribed, that the FDA had approved, that the clinical literature had supported, and that had quietly damaged something inside them that they would carry for the rest of their lives. Whether that damage progressed or stabilized or was never clinically significant, they would carry the knowledge of it and the uncertainty about what it meant. The uncertainty was its own kind of harm. The litigation that followed the Fen-Phen withdrawal was one of the largest pharmaceutical legal actions in American history. American Home Products, which had by this time been renamed Wyeth, eventually settled with plaintiffs for approximately $21 billion, one of the largest pharmaceutical settlements ever reached. The settlement was structured as a fund from which claimants could receive compensation based on the severity of their cardiac findings and the duration of their medication use. The fund was real and the settlement was substantial. It was also, for most of the women who filed claims, not quite the thing they were looking for. What the settlement could not provide was a clean medical answer to what had happened inside the bodies of the women who had taken Fen-Phen. The science on Fen-Phen cardiac toxicity evolved over the years following the withdrawal, and the picture that emerged was more complicated than the initial report suggested. Many patients whose echocardiograms showed abnormalities at the time of the withdrawal showed improvement or no change in follow-up studies. The relationship between Fen-Phen use and serious clinical outcomes was real but difficult to quantify precisely. This uncertainty, which is the normal condition of medical science, was cold comfort to the patients who had to decide whether to bring a claim and how to understand what had happened to their health. The Fen-Phen story was, in its essential structure, a variation on the story of the amphetamine era. A medication was developed and studied for a shorter period than the duration of eventual patient use. It was approved on the basis of evidence that was impressive for its time and incomplete in ways that would only become apparent after millions of patients had taken it. It was prescribed with enthusiasm because the cultural demand for weight loss solutions was enormous, and because the available evidence viewed charitably supported the prescribing. And then something appeared, in this case the cardiac valve findings, that the clinical trials had not predicted and that the regulatory process had not required anyone to look for, and the medication was withdrawn, and the patients who had taken it were left to understand what they had been part of. The Fen-Phen withdrawal in 1997 is the clearest moment of reckoning in the entire history of weight loss pharmacology. It is the moment when the cost of the prescribing became visible in a way that was measurable, documented, and litigated. The cardiac valve findings were real. The settlement was real. The damage, in whatever proportion and at whatever severity it occurred across the patient population, was real. And even in this moment of reckoning, the fundamental question about why a culture creates such enormous pressure for pharmaceutical weight loss solutions and what it costs the people who respond to that pressure was not the question being asked. The question being asked was, who bears the liability? The broader question waited, as it had always waited, for a moment that did not arrive. The FDA withdrew Fen-Phen from the market in September 1997, and the pharmaceutical industry did not stop working on weight loss medications. This is worth noting because it is tempting to read the Fen-Phen withdrawal as a kind of regulatory conclusion, as if the story of weight loss pharmacology had reached a natural endpoint, and the lesson had been learned and the field had paused to absorb it. None of this happened. The obesity epidemic, which was not going to stop because a medication had been withdrawn, continued, the pharmaceutical research continued, and the next generation of medications was already in development. Sibutramine, marketed as Meridia in the United States and Reductil in Europe, was approved by the FDA in 1997, the same year that Fen-Phen was withdrawn. The timing was extraordinary, though not conspiratorial. Pharmaceutical development takes years, and the sibutramine program had been proceeding independently of the Fen-Phen market. But the coincidence of the withdrawal and the approval meant that there was, almost immediately, a replacement available for physicians who were still seeking a pharmaceutical tool for weight management. The prescriptions that had been for Fen-Phen became, for many physicians and patients, prescriptions for Meridia. Sibutramine worked through a mechanism different from either amphetamine or fenfluramine. It was a serotonin and norepinephrine reuptake inhibitor, a SNRI, which meant that it prevented the nervous system from recycling these neurotransmitters after they had been released, leaving them active in the synaptic cleft for longer than they would otherwise remain. This extended action produced appetite suppression and, in some patients, a mild elevation of mood. The drug was studied more thoroughly before approval than Fen-Phen had been, partly because the FDA was alert, after the Fen-Phen experience, to the importance of cardiovascular monitoring. What the pre-approval studies showed was that sibutramine produced modest but meaningful weight loss, and that it also produced a small but consistent increase in blood pressure and heart rate. The FDA approved it with labeling that noted these cardiovascular effects and recommended monitoring, and with a contraindication for patients with a history of heart disease. This was a more careful regulatory posture than had characterized the Fen-Phen approval, and it reflected the lessons of that experience, to the extent that any regulatory lesson translates cleanly into practice. Meridia went on the market and was prescribed to millions of patients over the following decade. The patients who were prescribed it were, in most cases, not the same patients who had taken Fen-Phen. The Fen-Phen generation was now 10 years older, and the sibutramine patients were a new cohort, many of whom had never heard of Fen-Phen or knew it only as a cautionary tale from the previous decade. The warnings in the prescribing information about cardiovascular effects were there. They were the kind of warnings that patients receive and that physicians note, and that the daily reality of a busy clinical practice sometimes reduces to background. The cardiovascular signal that eventually brought Meridia down was different from the Fen-Phen signal. It was not valve disease, it was an increase in the risk of serious cardiovascular events, heart attack and stroke, in patients with established cardiovascular disease. The sibutramine cardiovascular outcomes trial, known as the SCOUT trial, was a large randomized controlled trial that enrolled patients at high cardiovascular risk. It found that patients on sibutramine had a 16% higher rate of major cardiovascular events than patients on placebo. The SCOUT trial results were published in 2010, 13 years after Meridia was approved. In October 2010, Abbott Laboratories, which had acquired the drug, withdrew it voluntarily following FDA review of the SCOUT data. The FDA statement on the withdrawal noted that the trial had shown an unacceptable increase in cardiovascular risk in the population studied. Meridia went the way of Fen-Phen, to a graveyard of weight loss medications that had been approved and then withdrawn after safety signals appeared that the approval process had not detected. The graveyard was already populous when Meridia joined it. Aminorex, a European weight loss drug of the 1960s, had been withdrawn after causing pulmonary hypertension. Fenfluramine had been withdrawn in 1997. Rimonabant, a cannabinoid receptor antagonist approved in Europe for weight loss in 2006, had been withdrawn in 2008, following reports of serious psychiatric side effects including depression and suicidality. Lorcaserin, approved in the United States in 2012, was withdrawn in 2020 after a safety study suggested an increased risk of cancer. The list had the quality of a recurring lesson that the system was learning very slowly. What distinguished each of these cases from simple pharmaceutical misfortune was the structural pattern they shared. Each drug had been approved on the basis of evidence that was genuinely supportive of its short-term efficacy, and that had not revealed, in the period of clinical investigation, the adverse effects that would eventually cause withdrawal. Each drug had been prescribed at scale before the safety signal emerged, and in each case the patient population that bore the consequences of the safety signal was not the same population that had been the subject of the clinical trials. The trial populations were selected, monitored, and evaluated in conditions that did not reflect the diversity and the clinical complexity of real patients taking a drug in the real world over real time. The interval between approval and withdrawal in these cases is worth attending to. Amenarex was on the European market for 2 years. Fenfluramine was on the US market for 24 years before withdrawal, though the Fen-Phen combination that produced the cardiac valve findings had only been in widespread use for about 5 years. Rimonabant was withdrawn after 2 years, lorcaserin after 8, sibutramine after 13. The average is over a decade. This means that the median weight loss drug that was eventually withdrawn was available for more than 10 years before the safety signal that led to its withdrawal was detected and acted upon. 10 years is a long time. In 10 years, millions of patients take a medication. Millions of patients are exposed to whatever risk the medication carries before that risk is fully characterized. These patients are not experimental subjects in the sense that they have not enrolled in a clinical trial. They are patients receiving standard medical care, but they are, in effect, participants in a very large study that runs until the study population is large enough and the follow-up period long enough to reveal what the controlled clinical trials did not. This is not a comfortable way to think about pharmaceutical approval, because it implies that the act of prescribing a new medication to a patient involves an element of uncertainty that the system's language does not acknowledge. A physician who prescribes an FDA-approved medication is, by the system's own framework, offering a treatment whose safety and efficacy have been established. The system is set up to provide that assurance. The historical record of weight loss medication suggests that the assurance, while not meaningless, is less absolute than either the physician or the patient understands it to be in the examination room. The women who took Meridia, and the women who took Fen-Phen, and the women who took Dexedrine were not foolish. They were responding to the incentives of a system that told them their weight was a medical problem, that presented pharmaceutical solutions as medically established, and that did not have, in most periods of this history, an adequate mechanism for communicating the limits of what it actually knew. The system did not know what it did not know, and the cost of not knowing was paid, in the aggregate, by the patients, and specifically by the women who were overwhelmingly the target market for weight loss pharmacology throughout the entire arc of this story. After the Meridia withdrawal, the FDA was left with a substantially depleted armamentarium of approved weight loss medications. Orlistat, which worked not through the central nervous system but by blocking the absorption of fat in the gut, remained available. Phentermine remained available, but only for short-term use and without combination partners. The market for weight loss medication was in a quieter period than it had been at any point in the previous 60 years, which meant that when the next generation of medications arrived, it arrived into an environment of accumulated frustration and renewed appetite for a solution that actually worked. The story of what came after Meridia is, in some ways, the most interesting chapter, because it describes the present, the world as it exists at the time of this narration, and the present has a character that is both genuinely different from what came before and in some aspects that require careful attention structurally familiar. The history that has been laid out in these chapters is not merely past, it is the context in which the present is happening, and it has something to say about the present that the present, in its understandable enthusiasm, has not yet had time to fully hear. There is a drug called semaglutide. You may know it by one of its trade names, Ozempic, Wegovy. It is a glucagon-like peptide-1 receptor agonist, which is a description that means something specific to an endocrinologist and that the general public has absorbed over the past several years in the distilled form of miracle weight loss injection. It was approved by the FDA for diabetes management in 2017 and for weight loss in 2021, and it has produced in the years since its weight loss approval the kind of cultural moment that the amphetamine era produced in the 1950s. A technology whose efficacy at producing weight loss is sufficiently dramatic that it is being discussed not merely as a medication, but as a potential solution to a public health problem of the first order. The clinical data on semaglutide is, by the standards of weight loss pharmacology, genuinely impressive. Patients in clinical trials lost an average of 15 to 17% of their body weight over the course of 68 weeks. This is significantly more than any previous weight loss medication had achieved. The drug works by mimicking a hormone called GLP-1, which is produced in the gut after eating and which signals to the brain that the body is full. In patients on semaglutide, the sensation of fullness is prolonged and the appetite is substantially reduced. Patients report that food stops being interesting in a way that is, by all accounts, quite different from the suppressed appetite of willpower and quite different also from the suppressed appetite of amphetamine. The mechanism also appears to produce something that earlier weight loss medications did not, a direct effect on cardiovascular risk. The SELECT trial, published in 2023, found that semaglutide reduced the risk of major adverse cardiovascular events by 20% in patients with established cardiovascular disease and obesity. This is a cardiovascular benefit, not a cardiovascular risk. It is the mirror image of the finding that brought Meridia down, and it is what has given cardiologists who might otherwise be expected to approach weight loss medications with the caution that the historical record warrants genuine enthusiasm about semaglutide. The cultural response to semaglutide has had a quality that is recognizable if you have been attending to the history outlined in this story. The drug is everywhere. It is in the newspapers and the celebrity interviews and the social media feeds and the doctors' offices, and in its shortage periods of 2022 and 2023, the frantic communications of patients who could not get it. There is a hunger around semaglutide, a particular appetite for a solution that has accumulated in the culture over decades of failed attempts and withdrawn medications, and the relentless repetition of the message that weight is a medical problem requiring a medical solution. The cultural hunger is the same hunger that filled the doctors' waiting rooms in 1958. The drug is different. The hunger is unchanged. The genuine excitement is warranted, in the limited sense that the clinical data is genuinely good, and the mechanism is genuinely different from previous weight loss medications. But the genuine excitement coexists with questions that the clinical trials have not fully answered, and that the regulatory framework has not required to be answered before widespread prescribing, and that are beginning to accumulate in the medical literature in the form of case reports and retrospective analyses and letters to journals that carry the particular epistemic weight of things that are real, but not yet conclusive. The questions include: what happens when patients stop taking semaglutide? The answer from the clinical trials is that the weight returns. Not in the way that it returned after Dexedrine, not in weeks, but over the course of months. Most of the lost weight comes back if the medication is stopped. This means that semaglutide, like every weight loss medication before it, works only while you take it, and that a patient who loses 30 pounds on semaglutide over a year will, if they stop the medication, regain most of those 30 pounds. The medication has an exit problem that is not different in its essential structure from the maintenance trap that characterized the amphetamine era. The questions also include what the long-term effects of continuous GLP-1 receptor agonism are on the gut and the pancreas and the brain. The mechanism of semaglutide involves suppressing the neural signaling that normally tells us we are hungry. Hunger, like all biological signals, serves functions. A signal that is pharmacologically suppressed for years may alter the systems it serves in ways that short clinical trials cannot reveal. The thyroid concerns that emerged in animal studies, rodents developed thyroid tumours with GLP-1 receptor agonist exposure, have not been replicated in human studies at the dose and duration studied, but human studies at longer durations have not been completed. The prescribing information carries a contraindication for patients with a personal or family history of thyroid cancer. This is the kind of caution that is based on incomplete evidence, which is the only kind of evidence currently available. There are also questions about muscle mass. The weight loss produced by semaglutide is not exclusively fat loss. A significant portion, estimates range from 25 to 40% of the total weight lost, is lean muscle mass. Muscle mass loss with aging is associated with increased risk of falls, fractures, and functional decline in older adults. The clinical significance of semaglutide-associated muscle loss in the long term is not yet known. Researchers are investigating whether resistance training or protein supplementation can mitigate this effect. The clinical trials did not address it systematically. And there are questions about the supply of dopamine that have begun to appear in the case reports and the animal studies. GLP-1 receptors are present in the brain's reward pathways, the same circuits involved in the experience of pleasure and the development of addiction. Semaglutide appears to reduce not only food-related appetite but also, in some patients and in animal models, the rewarding quality of alcohol and other addictive substances. This has been offered as a potential benefit, and clinical trials investigating semaglutide for alcohol use disorder and other addictions are underway. But it also raises a question about what long-term modulation of the reward system produces in the people who live inside it. The reward system is not a feature that can be quietly turned down, without consequences that may take years to manifest. The history of this should be said plainly. Every medication in this history was, at the time of its widest use, the product of genuine science. The studies that supported Dexedrine were real. The studies that supported Fen-Phen were real. The studies that supported Meridia were real. The safety profiles that the studies revealed were accurately reported, within the limits of what the studies were designed to detect. The limits were the problem. The limits were also the part that was not communicated clearly in the examination room, because the language of the examination room does not routinely accommodate statements like, "This medication has been studied for 3 years, and you may take it for 30, and we do not know what 30 years looks like." None of this means that semaglutide is Fen-Phen. The mechanisms are different, the cardiovascular data is different, and the regulatory scrutiny has been, in the post-Fen-Phen environment, considerably more sophisticated. But the pattern, the cultural hunger for a solution, the scale of prescribing that outpaces the duration of the clinical studies, the questions that accumulate in the literature while millions of people are already taking the medication, this pattern is old enough that it deserves recognition. What would it mean to read the semaglutide moment with historical awareness? It would mean holding two things simultaneously: genuine appreciation for a medication that appears to be significantly more effective and better studied than its predecessors, and genuine humility about what a few years of clinical data cannot tell you about 10 or 20 years of continuous use. It would mean asking the questions that the clinical trials were not designed to answer, not as accusations, but as the ordinary epistemic caution of someone who knows that the question what happens in the long run has been answered badly in this particular corner of medicine for the past 80 years. It would mean, also, sitting with the discomfort of a pharmaceutical industry that is, in the semaglutide era, genuinely trying harder than it was in 1955, and that still operates within a structure that rewards speed to market, that is more capable of detecting problems in years than in decades, and that is working in a culture that wants the answer to be yes, take this pill and will resist with considerable force any answer that is more complicated than that. The woman who walks into a doctor's office in 2026 and asks about semaglutide is in a different position than the woman who walked into a doctor's office in 1958 and received a Dexedrine prescription. The data is better, the regulatory framework is more demanding. The patient has access to information that her predecessor did not, and the fundamental structure of the encounter, the scale, the chart, the pill, the conversation about what is possible, is recognizable from the waiting room that opened this story. The waiting room persists. The drugs change. The question of what the drugs cost, in the fullest sense of that word, is still being asked in a language that is not yet complete. The semaglutide moment is where we are. The question is whether the historical awareness that could complicate it will be able to compete with the cultural momentum that has always made the new miracle feel, in the year of its arrival, entirely different from all the miracles that came before. It felt different in 1958. It felt different in 1992. It may feel different again now. The feeling is real. The history, unfortunately, is also real, and it has opinions. The pharmaceutical companies that sold the pills were not the only companies that made money from women's weight. They operated within a broader ecosystem of products and services and media that addressed from every angle the same fundamental anxiety, the anxiety about whether the body was acceptable, and that reinforced, in turn, the conditions that made women willing to take the pills. To understand the pharmaceutical history, you have to understand the ecosystem it lived inside, because the ecosystem and the pharmaceutical market were not separable things. They were the same thing, expressed in different commercial forms. The diet industry, the weight loss products, the programs, the books, the meal replacement shakes, the exercise equipment, the calorie counting systems, grew through the 1950s and 1960s in direct proportion to the cultural pressure on women's bodies. By 1965, Americans were spending $2 billion annually on weight loss products of all kinds, and the number was growing faster than the population. By 1990, the figure was $33 billion. By 2020, it had reached $72 billion, which is a number that is almost too large to hold in mind, and that becomes legible only when you understand it as the commercial expression of a cultural project that has been running, without significant interruption, for nearly a century. Weight Watchers was founded in 1963, the same year Friedan published The Feminine Mystique. The organisation grew from a series of meetings in a Queen's apartment founded by Jean Nedetch, who had lost weight and wanted to share what she had learned. By 1970, Weight Watchers had gone public and had annual revenue of more than $40 million. By 1978, it had been sold to H.J. Heinz for $71 million. The program was effective for many people, and it was built on genuine insights about behavior change and social support. But its existence also depended on, and reinforced, the cultural premise that weight was a problem requiring a systematic solution, and that the appropriate solution was a commercial one. The diet book was a genre that exploded in this period. Erwin Stillman's The Doctor's Quick Weight Loss Diet, published in 1967, sold 2.5 million copies within its first year. Herman Tarnower's Scarsdale Diet Book, published in 1979, was a #1 bestseller for months. Robert Atkins published Dr. Atkins' Diet Revolution in 1972, and though it was poorly received by mainstream medicine at the time, it sold millions of copies and established a framework that would eventually become the dominant paradigm in the early 2000s. Each book offered a slightly different solution to the same problem, and the success of each book demonstrated to publishers and subsequent authors that the market for weight loss solutions was essentially unlimited. Television added its own dimension. The scale of communication that television enabled allowed the diet industry to reach households in ways that print never had. Advertisements for diet programs, weight loss shakes, low-calorie foods, and exercise equipment became a staple of daytime programming, where the audience was understood to be primarily women at home. The Weight Watchers. Frozen dinner arrived in the late 1970s. The Slim Fast Shake arrived in 1977. The Nordic Track appeared in 1975. Each of these products was selling not only a function but a promise, and the promise was the same one that the amphetamine detail man had carried in his briefcase, that the body, which was currently insufficient, could be made sufficient if you purchased the right product. The diet industry and the pharmaceutical market were not simply parallel, they were mutually reinforcing. A woman who had tried the diet programs and the books and the shakes and had not achieved the results she was looking for was a woman who might be more receptive to a physician's suggestion that medication could help. A woman who had taken the medication and had lost the weight and then stopped the medication and regained it was a woman who might find herself back in the diet program, which would be temporarily effective, which would be followed by another weight gain, which might produce another visit to the physician. The ecosystem was designed, not conspiratorially, but by the logic of market incentives, to keep its customers inside it. One of the most remarkable features of this ecosystem is its stability over time. The specific products change. Liquid protein diets gave way to Slim Fast, which gave way to Atkins, which gave way to South Beach, which gave way to Keto. Benzedrine gave way to Dexedrine, which gave way to Fen-Phen, which gave way to Meridia, which gave way to semaglutide. But the ecosystem, the cultural pressure, the commercial response to that pressure, the pharmaceutical option at the medical end of the commercial spectrum, this structure has been stable for 70 years. The names in the magazines change, the architecture does not. There is a thing that research on marketing and consumer behavior calls the aspiration gap, the distance between how a person currently is and how they aspire to be. And the diet industry has always understood that its market depends on maintaining a certain size of aspiration gap. A culture in which women felt comfortable in their bodies would not be a culture in which the diet industry thrived. The cultural messages that maintained the aspiration gap, the beauty standards in the magazines, the thinness of the women on television, the particular silence that falls in the clothing store when a dress does not fit in the way it should, were not produced by the diet industry. but they were essential to its business model, and the industry that benefited from them was not inclined to discourage them. The pharmaceutical companies that sold weight loss medications were positioned at the medical end of this ecosystem, which gave them a different relationship to it than the diet programs and the meal replacement shakes. Medicine carries a specific kind of authority that commercial products do not, and the weight loss pharmaceutical market was able to draw on this authority in ways that Weight Watchers could not. A doctor's recommendation is a different kind of endorsement than an advertisement. The physician who suggested Dexedrine, or Fen-Phen, or Meridia was not merely selling a product. He was deploying the authority of medicine in support of the cultural project of managing women's weight. This is not an accusation. The physicians, in most cases, believed they were doing what medicine asked them to do, which was to treat a health condition with available evidence-based tools. The culture that had constructed the health condition was not something they were trained to interrogate. The pharmaceutical companies that provided the tools were operating legally and within the standards of their industry. The diet programs that occupied the other end of the ecosystem were simply commercial enterprises responding to market demand. None of these actors was required, by the norms of their respective fields, to step back and ask what the ecosystem as a whole was producing for the women inside it. The question of what the ecosystem as a whole was producing is the question that the history of this subject keeps returning to. The aggregate effect, measured over decades, of a culture that defined women's bodies as problems requiring management, and of the commercial and medical systems that organized themselves to manage those bodies. This aggregate effect is not captured in any single clinical study or any individual prescription. It is visible only from a distance, in the longitudinal view that the history provides. From that distance, what is visible is this. The weight loss pharmaceutical market, operating within the broader diet industry ecosystem, has not reduced the rate of obesity or the cultural pressure around women's weight. It has instead produced a recurring cycle of promised solutions, mass adoption, safety discoveries, and withdrawals, followed by the next promised solution. The obesity rates that the medications were intended to address have continued to rise through every pharmaceutical generation. The cultural pressure that drove women into the doctor's office has remained constant. The market has grown. The ecosystem is stable. This stability is not without its complexities. The scientific understanding of obesity has genuinely advanced over the same period, and the current appreciation of the biological and genetic determinants of body weight is considerably more sophisticated than the moral failing model that characterized the 1950s. The medical approach to obesity has shifted, at least in some quarters, toward a more compassionate and physiologically grounded framework. The conversation about the relationship between cultural beauty standards and health is richer and more nuanced than it was in the era of the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company tables. But the ecosystem persists, and its persistence means that the next pharmaceutical generation, whatever medication follows semaglutide, will enter the same market, respond to the same demand, and be evaluated by the same combination of clinical evidence and cultural appetite that has characterized every previous generation. The history suggests that this next medication will be received with considerable enthusiasm, will be prescribed at scale, and will eventually reveal long-term effects that the clinical trials did not capture. The history also suggests that the women who bear the cost of the revelation will do so largely without the institutional support of a system that is designed to produce the next medication rather than to account for the last one. Somewhere in a pharmaceutical laboratory, the next medication is being developed. Its mechanism is novel. Its early clinical data is promising. The researchers who are working on it are doing so with the genuine intention of producing something that helps people, and most of them are succeeding at this intention within the limits of what any clinical program can accomplish in the time it has. The molecule that will eventually carry the hopes of the next several million women is being purified in a centrifuge in a building that is clean and fluorescently lit and staffed by people who know a great deal about pharmacokinetics and considerably less about the history of the thing they are making. The history is not required curriculum. It is available to those who look for it in the archive. The centrifuge spins on. There are 5 questions that the history of weight loss pharmacology suggests you should ask about any new medication in the first 5 years of its existence before deciding what relationship you want to have with it. These questions are not the kind that appear on the pamphlet you receive at the pharmacy. They are the kind that are only available to you if you know the history that produced them, which is a long and specific history, and one that the culture has mostly preferred to forget between episodes. The first question is, what is the withdrawal profile? Not the side effects that appear while taking the medication, which are generally what the prescribing information and the clinical studies report. The withdrawal profile is what happens when you stop. This question is almost never asked in the first years of a new drug's market life, because the clinical studies have not yet been designed to answer it, and because the patient population that has stopped the drug is small. But the question predicts the maintenance trap. A drug that produces significant withdrawal effects, or that produces rapid weight regain when stopped, is a drug that is almost certainly going to be prescribed indefinitely to its patient population, which means that the long-term safety studies that would follow patients through years of continuous use are the relevant data, and those studies will not exist for years. The second question is, what is the mechanism's reach? Every pharmaceutical compound that acts on a biological pathway is acting on a pathway that exists throughout the body, not only in the cells the drug is targeting. The serotonin receptors that fenfluramine stimulated existed in cardiac valves. The sympathomimetic receptors that amphetamine stimulated existed in the cardiovascular system. The GLP-1 receptors that semaglutide activates exist in the brain, the pancreas, the thyroid, the gut, and the heart. A drug whose mechanism is limited to one cell type or one tissue is a drug that can be understood with some completeness through targeted studies. A drug whose mechanism involves receptors distributed throughout the body is a drug whose full profile can only be understood over time and through a diversity of outcomes measures that 5-year studies cannot provide. The third question is, who was in the trial? Clinical trial populations are selected, and the selection process matters enormously for the generalizability of the results. Trials exclude patients who are pregnant, who have certain medical conditions, who are taking certain other medications, who are above or below certain age ranges. The patients who are excluded from trials are not the same as the patients who will eventually receive the drug. The drug that works well and safely in a trial population of carefully selected adults may work differently in elderly patients, or in patients with comorbidities, or in patients who are also taking the other medications that the real world requires. The gap between the trial population and the prescribed population is where safety signals go to hide. The fourth question is, who is asking? The clinical studies that demonstrate a drug's efficacy and safety are, in most cases, funded in some form by the pharmaceutical company that makes the drug. This does not make the studies dishonest. Most pharmaceutical research is conducted with genuine scientific rigor, because pharmaceutical companies need the science to hold up to regulatory scrutiny, and because scientists, even employed ones, generally prefer accuracy to the alternative. But industry funding influences what questions get asked, which outcomes get measured, which populations get studied, and which results get published, and which ones wait. The history of selective publication, the tendency to publish positive results more readily than negative ones, is sufficiently well documented in the pharmaceutical literature to warrant caution about any safety or efficacy profile that is based exclusively on industry-funded research. The fifth question is, what does the independent literature say after 5 years? In the first 2 to 3 years of a new drug's market life, most of the published literature about it is the clinical trial data that supported approval, plus the early case reports and pharmacovigilance data that appear as the drug enters wide use. The independent literature, the academic analyses that are not directly funded by the manufacturer, the registry studies, the long-term cohort studies, the meta-analyses, takes time. It takes time to assemble, to fund, to complete, to publish. The first 5 years of a new medication's life are, in many ways, the period of least complete independent knowledge. This is also the period of maximum prescribing enthusiasm, because the drug is new and the promise is fresh, and the counterbalancing weight of accumulated independent evidence has not yet arrived. These questions are not designed to make you avoid medication. They are designed to locate you accurately within the timeline of knowledge about a specific drug, which is a different thing from the timeline of knowledge the system presents to you. The system presents you in the examination room with the state of knowledge as of the last time your physician reviewed the literature, filtered through the FDA approval status, expressed in the confident language of established medicine. This is not false, but it describes a moment in a longer story, and the story has not always ended well. The history of amphetamines for weight loss ended in a generation of women whose dependence was never adequately acknowledged, and whose withdrawal was largely unsupported. The history of Fen-Phen ended with 30% of its patient population having demonstrable cardiac valve changes and a multi-billion-dollar litigation. The history of Meridia ended with a withdrawal based on cardiovascular risk in a subset of patients. Each of these endings was, in its time, genuinely unforeseeable from the vantage point of the approval. The science that revealed the harm did not exist at the time the harm was being done, but the pattern was foreseeable. The pattern of prescribing ahead of long-term data, of approving on the basis of mechanisms that had not been fully characterized in human tissue over human timescales, of cultural pressure so enormous that the system adapted its requirements to accommodate it. This pattern was visible in retrospect at every stage of the history. It is visible now to anyone who looks. Looking is not a comfortable thing to do, because looking requires holding the discomfort of uncertainty in a cultural moment that is offering a very large pharmaceutical solution and a very confident set of clinical claims. It requires the ability to say, simultaneously, this is the best thing available, and the best thing available is not the same as a thing we fully understand. These are not contradictory positions. They are the accurate positions, and they require a tolerance for the kind of ambiguity that medical language is generally designed to smooth away. The women of the 1950s who received their Dexedrine prescriptions were not credulous. They were responding to the best available medical advice, delivered by credentialed professionals, in a cultural context that had prepared them to trust this advice and to want the outcome it offered. The women who received Fen-Phen in 1996 were in the same position. So, in a different pharmaceutical moment with different drugs and different risks, are the people, overwhelmingly women, still, who are prescribed weight loss medications today. The framework is not a substitute for the conversation with your physician, which is a conversation that should be had and that should include the specific details of your specific health situation, which are more relevant to your individual medical decisions than any historical overview. But the framework is a supplement to that conversation, a set of questions that the history of this subject has earned the right to ask, and that the culture that produced the history has not always been very good at asking. There is one more question that the framework does not fully capture, but that the history keeps suggesting. It is the question of why. Why the weight? Why the pills? Not in the sense of appetite biology, which is a question that medicine has been studying for decades and has partially answered, but in the cultural sense. Why does a society organize itself around the management of women's weight to the extent that it will produce pharmaceutical market after pharmaceutical market, each one absorbing the failures of the last and producing new patients for the next one? Why is the question being asked, generation after generation, by women sitting in waiting rooms whose chairs are in different decades, but whose structure is always the same? The framework, if it is honest, has to include this question. Not because the answer will make the medication decision easier, it won't, but because the absence of the question makes the medication decision seem simpler than it is. The pill is a response to a problem. The problem is partly biological and partly cultural, and the cultural part is not addressed by the pill, which is why the problem persists through every pharmaceutical generation, and why each new pill arrives into the same waiting room, with the same woman in the chair, who has the same conversation with the same doctor, and goes home with a different amber bottle that she puts on the kitchen counter beside the coffee maker and begins the next morning before breakfast. Somewhere in Ohio, the woman who might have been Dorothy or Margaret or Barbara is no longer taking her Dexedrine. She has not taken it for 50 years. She has grandchildren now. She is heavier than she was when she was taking the pills, though this fact occupies her less than it used to, having receded over the decades into a background that contains many more interesting things. She's never been told, in any clinical setting, that what she went through in those years was pharmaceutical dependence. She has always assumed it was her. This is the part of the history that the framework cannot fix, but that it is worth knowing about in the quiet of a late night, with the particular honesty that tiredness provides. There is a category of historical harm that does not appear in the clinical literature because no one thought to look for it, or because the vocabulary that would make it visible had not yet been developed, or because the people who carried it were not the kind of people whose carrying was considered a medical finding. The women of the amphetamine era carried something that belongs to this category. They carried it home from the pharmacy in an amber bottle, and they carried it through the years that followed the bottle being empty, and some of them are still carrying it. In the particular way that the body carries things it was asked to do at a cellular level, and has never fully been asked to stop. The long-term neurological effects of multi-year amphetamine use were not systematically studied in the population of women who took Dexedrine through the 1950s and 1960s. This is a gap in the scientific record that cannot now be filled, because the data that would have captured it was never collected. What exists are fragments, case reports, retrospective accounts, the epidemiological data on depression rates in women of that generation, which are elevated in ways that may or may not be attributable to medication history, and that no one thought to attribute to medication history at the time. What we know from subsequent research on amphetamine and related stimulants is that prolonged use alters the dopamine system in ways that are measurable, and that persist after the medication is stopped. The dopaminergic changes associated with long-term stimulant exposure include downregulation of dopamine receptors, reduction in dopamine transporter availability, and changes in the prefrontal cortex that affect executive function and emotional regulation. These are findings from research conducted primarily in the context of substance use disorder, on populations that use stimulants in larger quantities and by different routes than the women who took prescribed oral Dexedrine. The applicability of these findings to the suburban housewife population of the 1960s is uncertain. But uncertainty is not the same as absence. The uncertainty is itself a product of a failure to study a population that was, at the time, considered too ordinary to be worth a longitudinal investigation. The women taking prescribed diet pills were not patients in whom anyone expected to find lasting neurological change, because lasting neurological change was a category associated with addiction, and addiction was a category associated with other kinds of people taking other kinds of drugs. The suburban housewife on Dexedrine was invisible to the researchers who might have found her interesting, and remained invisible until she was too far from the exposure to be studied. The women who took Fen-Phen are more visible in the medical literature, because the Fen-Phen withdrawal created a litigation-driven medical evaluation. The echocardiographic data from the 1997 and subsequent screenings represents one of the most thorough medical follow-up studies of a drug-exposed population in pharmaceutical history, driven not by scientific interest, but by legal requirement. Women who'd taken Fen-Phen were screened, and screened again, and their cardiac status was monitored. What emerged from this monitoring was a picture more complicated than the initial reports had suggested. Many patients whose echocardiograms had shown abnormalities in 1997 showed improvement or stabilization on follow-up. The cardiac valve changes associated with Fen-Phen were, in the majority of cases, mild and did not progress to clinical heart disease. A smaller but significant number of patients did develop progressive disease requiring medical management or, in some cases, surgical intervention. The distribution of outcomes was wide, and the factors that determined which patients had which outcome were not fully characterized. What the medical literature did not address, because it was not equipped to address it, was what it was like to receive an echocardiogram in 1997 and be told that you had changes in your heart valves from a medication your doctor had prescribed. The experience of being a patient who had trusted the medical system, who had followed the advice of a credentialed physician, who had taken an FDA-approved medication, and who had then been told that the medication had marked something inside them. This was not a medical finding. It was a human experience that the medical system had no particular structure for addressing. The Wyeth Settlement Fund provided money, which is what litigation produces. It did not provide a reckoning. There was no national moment in which the Fen-Phen experience was processed as a collective failure of a system. The pharmaceutical approval process, the prescribing norms, the cultural pressure that had created the demand, rather than as the wrongdoing of a specific company. Wyeth paid its settlement and continued operating, and was eventually acquired by Pfizer, and the Fen-Phen experience was absorbed into the pharmaceutical industry's institutional memory as a cautionary tale about cardiac safety monitoring, rather than as a broader question about the relationship between cultural pressure, pharmaceutical marketing, and the bodies of women. The question of the broader pattern is one that the culture prefers not to ask, because asking it leads to uncomfortable places. It leads to the question of why women are the primary target market for weight loss pharmacology. It leads to the question of what creates the market, not the pharmaceutical companies, who are responding to demand, but the cultural apparatus that creates the demand, the particular definition of the female body as a problem requiring management that has been so consistent across the decades of this history that it functions less like a cultural attitude and more like a structural feature. It leads, if you follow it far enough, to the question of why thinness continues to function as a moral category in a culture that has simultaneously produced several decades of body-positive discourse and an $800 a month weight loss injection that is, at the time of this narration, difficult to obtain because demand exceeds supply. The discourse and the injection coexist, and their coexistence says something about the complexity of changing a cultural attitude that is embedded in medical practice, insurance reimbursement, social interaction, and the deepest levels of how women have learned to evaluate themselves. The women who took Dexedrine and the women who took Fen-Phen and the women who took Meridia were not passive victims of a system they had no role in. They were agents making decisions within a set of options and incentives that the system had constructed for them, and the decisions they made were rational within that context. Understanding this does not reduce the harm. It does situate the harm accurately within the system that produced it, which is a necessary step toward understanding how the system continues to produce variations on the same harm in each pharmaceutical generation. The carrying, in the specific sense of what these women carried inside them after the pills, is a complicated thing to talk about because it involves both the pharmacological and the experiential, and the two are not always distinguishable. A woman who took Dexedrine for 10 years and found, in the years after the prescription ended, that mornings were harder, and moods were flatter, and the particular brightness that she associated with her productive years was not available without the pill. This woman was carrying something. Whether it was neurological change or the memory of neurological change, whether her brain had been altered or she had simply become accustomed to an altered state, was a distinction that her experience was not equipped to resolve. What they carried also included the particular kind of doubt that is available to women who have been told, in one way or another, that their subjective experience is not reliable. A woman who went to her doctor in 1972 and said she felt different since the pills stopped, worse, less capable of ordinary pleasure, was a woman who might be told that this was the normal adjustment period, or that she was experiencing mild depression, or that she should try to get more exercise. She was not told that her experience was consistent with what the pharmacological literature on stimulant discontinuation would eventually describe. She was not told this because no one in the room knew it. The doubt that comes from not being believed, or from being offered explanations that do not fit the experience, is a particular kind of carrying. It is the carrying of the knowledge that something happened, alongside the absence of any external confirmation that the something was real. This is what many of the women of the amphetamine era carried after the amber bottles were empty. Not only the aftermath of the medication, but the particular loneliness of an aftermath that had no name. What they carried, in the end, is what most women carry who have lived inside a culture's idea of what a woman's body should be. The particular weight of being measured, in a way that men's bodies have rarely been measured, against a standard that is defined outside the body itself. The pharmaceutical industry offered to make the carrying lighter, and its offers were genuine, and the science behind them was real, and the carrying persisted anyway, because the offering was always to the symptom, and the culture that produced the symptom remained untouched. This is not a story about pharmaceutical greed. Though pharmaceutical greed is part of the story, it is a story about what a culture decides a woman's body should cost her, and what she's willing to pay, and what systems arise to help her pay it, and what the paying turns out to extract. Let us return for the last time to the waiting room. It is 1958, and the floor wax smell is still there, and the green vinyl chairs still squeak when you shift your weight, and the magazines are the same ones as before, though the woman with the lacquered hair has replaced last month's Good Housekeeping with this month's Ladies' Home Journal, which has a different pie on the cover. The fountain pen scratches. The clock on the wall works its way around in the particular silence of a room where people sit and wait to be seen. There is a woman in the second chair from the left who is 34 years old. She has been here before, twice in the past year, and both times she is left with a prescription that she fills at the pharmacy on the corner of Oak and Maple, and takes home and puts on the kitchen counter and begins the following morning before breakfast. She is, in the accounting of the period, a success. She has lost 18 pounds. Her doctor has expressed satisfaction. Her husband has said she looks well. The scale, when she steps on it at the monthly check-in, delivers a verdict that the culture around her would call good news. What the scale does not measure, and what no one in 1958 has yet thought to ask about, is what it costs to be 18 pounds lighter. Not in any dramatic sense, not in anything that could be pointed to and named. The cost is more subtle and more distributed than that. It is in the quality of the afternoon. It is in the particular relationship that has developed between her and the amber bottle on the counter, which she does not think of as a relationship, but which is one, which requires a daily attendance that she cannot yet imagine interrupting. It is in the way she has learned to manage the bottle's contents carefully through the last week of the month, knowing that she will refill it on the first, but also knowing, without being able to say that she knows this, that the days before the refill are harder in a way that has nothing to do with appetite. She does not know the word dependence in the way it will come to be used. She knows the word habit, which is what the culture calls it, when a person is attached to something in a way that requires them to continue. She does not apply it to herself, because habit, in the vocabulary of 1958, carries a judgment that a woman receiving a physician's prescription is not willing to apply to her own medical care. She's a patient, not a person with a habit. The distinction feels important. It will feel less important in a decade when the distinction will be erased by regulatory categories, but it will never be acknowledged by anyone with authority as the error it was. What she carries out of the waiting room each month is a small piece of paper that authorises the amber bottle, and also something that has no paper form, the quiet assumption, shared between her and her doctor, and the culture they inhabit, that the management of her body is a continuous project requiring pharmaceutical intervention, and that this is simply what it means to be a woman who is trying, in the language of the decade, to take care of herself. Taking care of yourself in 1958 means tending to the body's shortcomings. It means working on the body rather than for it. It means the amber bottle and the monthly check-in and the particular discipline of a Tuesday on Dexedrine. From here, the story moves through 50 years that we have travelled together through this night. The prescriptions change, the chemistry changes, the names change, from Dexedrine to fenfluramine to sibutramine to semaglutide, each name arriving in a different decade with a different mechanism and a similar promise, each one received with the particular cultural hunger that a society maintains when it has decided that women's bodies are a problem requiring a solution, and that the solution should be available at the pharmacy. The waiting room persists, though its chairs are no longer green vinyl, and the magazines on the side table are now on a tablet screen. The scale persists. The fountain pen has become a computer. The prescription has become a printout. The amber bottle is still amber. What persists most stubbornly is the basic architecture of the encounter. A woman, a scale, a doctor who is not unkind, a pharmaceutical option that appears in the current state of the evidence to work, a conversation that includes most of what is known and some of what is unknown, and almost none of what history would suggest asking, and a prescription carried out through the waiting room into whatever year it is, into whatever cultural apparatus has organised itself around the female body in this particular decade, to be filled at the pharmacy and placed on the kitchen counter and begun the next morning before breakfast. The narrator of this story is not angry about any of this, though she has her reasons. She is not alarmed, because alarm serves no one who is trying to fall asleep, and also because the history is sufficiently distant in most of its episodes to have settled into something that can be held with the steadiness of perspective rather than the sharpness of present grievance. What she is, if she is anything, is informed about the shape of the story that has been telling itself through the medicine cabinets and the pharmacy shelves and the doctor's offices of the past 80 years. The shape is a cycle, and cycles have a particular quality when viewed from the right distance. They are calming, in the way that recurring patterns are calming, in the way that tides are calming, because they establish that the world has a rhythm, and that the rhythm can be understood if you are patient enough to observe it through several repetitions. The cycle of weight loss pharmacology is not comforting in its content, but it is comprehensible in its form, and comprehensibility is a form of peace. The women who took the pills did not fail the cycle. The cycle is not a test. They were ordinary people doing what ordinary people do when the culture around them offers them something that appears to address a problem that the culture itself has defined. The problem was not theirs. The solution was not theirs. The cost, unfortunately, was, This is a distribution of responsibility that the history documents but cannot resolve, and the narration of this story will not attempt to resolve it either, because the resolution is not available in the late hour of a night that is winding toward quiet. What is available at this hour is this: the waiting room, the fountain pen, the amber bottle cool in the palm, the particular stillness of the story having arrived at its end, which is also its beginning, which is what cycles do. Somewhere in New Jersey, in the mathematics of a half-century ago, a woman is standing in a department store dressing room with a seafoam dress that does not fit in the way it should, and she is making a calculation that will be made by millions after her, and the calculation will produce an industry, and the industry will produce medications, and the medications will be taken on kitchen counters in the mornings before the household wakes. And somewhere at the far end of this history, which is a history that has not ended yet, a person is deciding whether to begin a new medication, in a new century, with new science behind it and familiar questions in front of it. The waiting room continues. The fountain pen scratches. The amber bottle rattles softly with a sound that this story has been trying to help you hear clearly, which is the sound of a promise and a price, together in the same small container, and the question of which one you are holding when you tip it into your palm. The history is here. You have it now. You can carry it lightly, which is the only way anyone carries the complicated things in the dark when sleep is finally coming. Carry it lightly. Set it down on the nightstand beside whatever bottle is on yours. Know that you know something that the women of 1958 did not know, and that knowing it is the small and permanent gift that history offers when it is attended to honestly. The waiting room empties at the end of the day. The receptionist locks the door. The magazines on the side table remain, as they always remain, waiting for tomorrow's appointments, tomorrow's women in tomorrow's chairs, with tomorrow's prescriptions in tomorrow's hands. The green vinyl chairs stop squeaking. The clock on the wall continues its unhurried work. The fountain pen, capped, rests on the desk in the dark. This is where the story lives, in the quiet at the end of the day, when the doctor has gone home and the prescriptions have been written, and the women who received them are home in their own kitchens, the amber bottles on their counters, the mornings ahead of them ordinary and particular and entirely theirs. The story does not end here. It begins again, as all cycles begin again, in another morning, in another decade, with another name on another bottle. But for tonight, the story rests. And so, now, can you. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. The waiting room is quiet now. The clock on the wall is wound down into the particular stillness of very late, and the magazines on the side table are no longer being read, and the green vinyl chairs have stopped their soft squeaking. The fountain pen is capped. The prescription pad is in the drawer. The amber bottle is on the counter at home, where it has been for 60 years, in one form or another, under one name or another, offering the same small rattle. Let the story rest here. Let it settle, the way sediment settles in water that has finally stopped moving, into something still and readable. The women who took the pills and the women who did not. The doctors who prescribed with good intentions and the industry that provided with good profits. The decades of amber bottles and the decades of questions that the amber bottles contained alongside the pills. Let all of it settle. The night has its own medicine, which is the gentle and reliable anesthetic of sleep, and it does not require a prescription, and it does not have a withdrawal profile, and it has been effective for as long as there have been women who needed rest and could not find it. You are finding it now. The story is over in the way that stories are over when the telling is done, which is not the same as the story being resolved, but which is enough for tonight. The waiting room empties, the lights go down. Somewhere outside, the particular quality of very late is settling over everything, over the kitchen counters and the pharmacy shelves and the medical journals and the clinical trials, and the women who are in them and the women who are not, settling softly, without alarm, without urgency, with the particular peace of someone who has come to know a story all the way to its end, and who has made a kind of peace with what the end contains. Sleep now. The history will be here in the morning, and in the morning you will know it better than you did before tonight, and knowing it better is enough. It is enough to know the shape of the story, the rhythm of the cycle, the particular sound of the amber bottle on the kitchen counter at 6 in the morning before the day begins. Knowing it you are less inside it than you were, knowing it is its own small freedom. The night deepens, the quiet deepens with it. Let the breathing slow and the thoughts thin, the way thoughts thin at the edge of sleep, becoming less coherent and more like the texture of rest, which is not a place but a quality that arrives when you stop trying to arrive at it. You're already there. The waiting room is empty, the door is closed, the story is told. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments. Have you ever been told by a doctor that a medication was safe and later found out it was more complicated than that? Or do you have someone in your life whose experience with diet pills, from any decade, made you think differently about how we treat women's bodies? I'd love to hear from you in the comments below.